Just see if anybody's coming in. Yeah, I think you, worship, you could open the meeting and we're ready.
So I'll call to order the committee of the whole from the 23rd. And in honor of the Mi'waq'uwal'o, the village of Pemberton acknowledges that we are meeting within the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. For those members of the public in attendance, please note that this meeting is a live webinar and is being recorded. A recording of the meeting will be available on the village's website following the meeting. Any amendments to the agenda? As presented, Councillor Craddock, seconded by Councillor Ramsden. Any opposed? Motion carries. Approval of minutes from regular committee of the whole 243 from April 25th, moved by Councillor Ramsden, seconded by Councillor Craddock. Any opposed? Motion carries. Any business arising? None. We are going to go right up to 6.1. We're going to do today's meeting event, the NICMA workshop, and I will pass it over to Mr. Chalmers.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning, everyone. Very grateful to be here this morning. I think get comfortable. We're going to be at it for a little while, and this is the first of what we expect will be at least a couple of these sessions. And so I'm going to, with the mayor's indulgence, kind of take the reins on this just a little bit and walk us through the workshop. And really what the goal is today is we're going to kind of go through the process, the plan. This is about dialogue. This is about getting back and forthing, which is why we're going to ask the mayor to participate as an attendee, and we're going to try to knuckle into this thing just a little bit. Now, to begin with, the purpose really is to put this plan that we prepared a draft of in the context of other village policies, other things that are happening. You know, we've heard a lot of the same questions I'm sure you have about how this thing fits in, what it is, what it does, what it means. And then we're going to dig into the plan itself, and we're going to start going through the policy directions, looking at it at a higher level. This is not a finished product. We've got spelling mistakes, we've got punctuation errors, we've got numbers that are messed up. It was not intended to be a draft. In fact, a complete product. It is a draft, and it actually turned out a little bit more spit and polish than I would normally like to have the first draft released. But we're going to start at the beginning and work our way down. So we also will then have a period at the end where we'll go through and talk about the upcoming process, what's remaining. Again, this is one element of a fairly substantial approval that has multiple approvals, and this plan is critical, but there's other things that are of great importance to council and the community that come through other processes. So we'll try to carry that out. So in terms of the format, we will facilitate this as best we can. We're going to try to get through a fairly robust agenda in 3 hours, which I think we can do. To do that, we've kind of prepared some brief intro slides. I'm not going to walk through the detailed contents of the plan. You've had the plan now for some time. We're going to instead talk about it at a high level. We'll try to describe what we're trying to achieve through the policy sets or why certain parts of the plan are in there, and then we're open to comments. Any questions, any feedback, anything at all is more than welcome. This is what it is. Today's not really a debate day. What we're hoping to achieve at the end is that, and we use this format quite frequently with the committees, is just a little story. I remember once we were at the latter stages of the waterfront land use sub-area plan. I wrote that in 2007, 2008, something like that. And we walked into committee of the whole, and the applicants left knowing that if they put more parking in, they'd make one member happy, and if they put less parking in, they'd make the other happy. So we're going to try to identify areas that either need some discussion, further discussion, and park those and bring them back to another meeting. Or if there's some consensus around certain things that the committee wants us to explore in more detail, we're going to put those in the form of a resolution at the end. So we'll kind of walk you through a bit of a process. The idea is that we will respond to resolutions. We always try to incorporate comments, but it's a lot easier for us if we know that we're working with the will of the body rather than an individual comment, because just like everywhere, sometimes individual comments don't mesh out. We're also going to be thinking of the resolutions today as more things for us to go and explore. Some of them might be 1-minute explorations because they make sense and they're the right move. But when we get into a project like this, there's a lot of ripple down effects from what could seem like a fairly simple change. And we want to make sure that we understand all of those. So what we will do is when the committee of the whole provides us a direction, we'll put that in a table, we'll deal with it and we'll report back on every single one that you provide. But this is not change this word to this session today. You'll have that section when we get towards the end. What we're really hoping to achieve today is a real common understanding about the Silveira Plan's context, where it came from, why it's happening, its role and its process. Really, this is, we've had several dialogues in the community, but this is the first formal kind of takeover where the village is now taking ownership of a draft plan that we've prepared and are going to be taking it out to the public and potentially working it through its bylaw process. So in terms of the agenda, this is fluid. This is not classical, it's jazz for sure. We're going to take the length it takes and we're going to do what we need to do, but this kind of based on my own intuition. We've got kind of 3 segments. We'll take a little break in between each one. The first one is really getting into some more of the background and drilling into that just a little bit further, talking about the context. This will in some ways replicate the presentation that was given to the community by the village on April 20th. And we'll talk about the role of the SE, the sub-area plan. Then we set aside an hour and a half to go through the content of the plan. So this is where we start saying, not far enough with this policy approach, or going too far. Or what's missing, what do you like even, what's always nice feedback to get to. And then at the end, we've got 30 minutes to craft the resolutions and ideas for next steps. So we will again circle around and talk about the rezoning process and what the work that's starting on that and moving into additional consultation. So we definitely want the committee's feedback on some of the process, which we've had a chance to discuss it. You're going to see this slide come up at various periods. And as I mentioned, what we're hoping to do is I'll stop the presentation and start recording comments or notes or questions. So again, this is a series of maybe 10 or 12 mini presentations with an opportunity to discuss elements of the plan in sequence and the process in sequence. So we'll take these notes at the end and we'll kind of list them all out. And from that, we can see if there's consensus to build a resolution out of that, or if there's other areas that we need to go to have more discussion on at a committee of the whole level before we're comfortable looking at changes to either the process or to the plan. So at this point, any comments or questions, ideas for how to make the day fun? 3 hours until there. I could do this all day. I got it. I really do. Even the 12 o'clock. You know, I like hearing this talk a little bit. So where we are and where we are not, it's really important to understand where we are in this process. I kind of tipped my head a little bit. We are not at the end of a sub-area plan process. We're kind of just at the beginning of the middle of it. And I have a slide that will explain that in a sec. But one of the things that we really need to think about and what distinguishes this planning exercise from a lot of other sub-area plans, I've done a number of these over the years. This one is somewhat different because there is already land use in place. The land is already in the OCP for residential. What that means, what that looks like, is that since the 2011 OCP, which incorporated a 2007 neighborhood plan, this has been an assumed part of the village's land bank for development going forward. It hasn't come to fruition, it hasn't developed. That's really normal. When you do an OCP update, you're looking at a 20 to 30 year land supply and you're identifying it. What that document does, what the OCP does often, is that's the thing that the school district looks at when they do their forecasting. It's what the province looks at when they look at health allocations, emergency services, and all of those things. And we've heard some comment from the community about how these pieces fit together. And because this is not a greenfield inclusion of a new community, and what's proposed is a modification of what's already been approved, we haven't done things like a detailed socioeconomic impact assessment because things have been building off of that plan. When you do that plan, more agencies than just the village use it in figuring out what their plans are moving forward. The OCP designation is really important in a lot of ways, and there are some policies specific to this site. But what's even more critical is that the land is zoned. The land is zoned right now for single attached residential, which means conceivably an owner could come in and apply for development, generally in the form shown on this plan, without any discretionary approvals from the village. So no need for rezoning, no need for OCP amendment, and the approving officer would adjudicate the subdivision. So this again, it's a bit unique. This plan has taken a spin towards implementation more than some of the land use justification stages. So areas of other sub-area plans I've done, which do a lot to try and figure out how the change in land use from one use to a residential use or to a commercial use, to see how that fits in. We haven't really had to do that exercise. We haven't done a lot of that. So the population projections and analysis in this sub-area plan is 1.5 pages. Other ones, sometimes it triggers a whole growth management study on its own. So the context and the starting point is really, really important. So where we are, the draft, as I said, I'm going to say this a million times because it's true. It's not a finished product. We're not representing it as such. Really what we've tried to do is take the work that's been done so far and amalgamate it into one place. That's what the sub-area plan does. It takes a whole host of considerations and things that we want to think about as we're planning it, and it records it in one place. And then it creates policy to make sure that the future decisions, like rezoning and development permits, all tie back into that same body of knowledge. There's a lot of things that we haven't done yet. We're just really getting our heads wrapped around some of the municipal servicing provisions. The applicants did commission or did pay for, and the village commissioned a modeling exercise for water, sanitary, and storm systems. The results of that are hot off the presses. There's no huge roadblocks there, but there are some questions that we're working through. So we're not here again to represent that we have answers to every question, but we have an approach and a plan for how we will be able to answer every question. We're starting to move into, and this is critical, but we are just starting the discussions around amenities, including affordable housing. Because as we'll talk about a little bit throughout the day, there's a lot of information that we need before we can start looking at making sure the village is getting the right apportionment of amenities. And off-site servicing cost is usually the big one. That will swing the amount of available opportunities for things like amenities and affordable housing. So again, it's all being done quite methodically. It's taking some time, but that's the way it's processing. Similarly, when you look at this plan, this is what we would call an illustrative concept plan. And really what it is it's a translation of how the land use may work. It does start locking in things like road alignment and some other things, but there's still some questions we have around access and affecting access. And the plan has a policy that says they need to find one, and they're out. In fact, the applicants are out looking for options right now. Again, I mentioned we're still exploring things like housing diversity options. There's a lot of opportunities that this site may represent that we collectively agreed at a staff and applicant level need to be explored, but we haven't done detailed exploration yet. It's more a matter of we've planted the seeds for that in this plan, and there'll be additional work moving forward. And critically, the financial model, the village doesn't typically do detailed pro forma analysis, the pro forma being the complete accounting of costs and revenues for a project. But we do need to understand generally the performance of this from a financial perspective. And from the village perspective, that's things like servicing obligations and costs, which at this point, all of the new servicing will be the responsibility of the applicant. Certainly, they would also have to likely do some remedial work for infrastructure that's not up to par right now. And then we really need to make sure that the amenity package, just like the policy requires, the amenity package and affordable housing package is calibrated to making sure that the project remains viable on one hand, but produces the best possible outcomes for the village. So in terms of the sub-area process alone, breaking a very complicated process into chunks, we're kind of through the information collection and synthesis. There's been a number of inputs into this, which are described in the plan. We've done through that process, part of the information collected was public consultation. We're now moving into a process where we've consolidated all of that into the plan, and we're moving through a refinement and review of that plan. And then ultimately, as an OCP amendment, this plan would be adopted into the OCP as a bylaw. So there'd be a bylaw process for reading as well. terms of the overall development process, and again, there's a lot of ebbs and flows in this, but in very broad strokes, we're still at the very beginning. We've been concentrating mostly on the OCP amendment. And we're moving into, the arrow is supposed to be lower. We're moving into the rezoning and development agreement discussions. Following that, there'll likely be multiple development permits, one master subdivision perhaps, and then multiple subdivisions, servicing agreements, a whole host of things. What we're hoping is that by the time the OCP amendment comes to the council, it will come as a package with the zoning and the development agreement, and we will be able to very clearly map out how this project will unfold over years. It's a really important tool. The village is managing some other large multi-year development projects with a different suite of tools that, in my opinion, the village is doing a great job doing so, but this will be very robust. It will stand the test of time, yet have some flexibility to respond to things that emerge over the years. That's the goal. So why a sub-area plan? The real focus of this one in particular is on implementation. As I mentioned right now, the applicants could proceed with a subdivision without any of the things that you see in the plan. Some of the development permit area guidelines, the policy directions, the land uses that are in this plan, that could happen. The applicants could have also applied for the same rezoning they've applied for without an OCP amendment. The land is designated residential and their zoning application is consistent with that. From the outset, I think, and it wasn't a hard conversation by any stretch, but the applicants and staff agreed that this was of a scale and of a nature where we needed to look at and reassess some of the initial planning work in the neighborhood concept plan. A lot has changed. The housing demands and needs have changed since 2007, 2011, the bulk of the work was being done. The aspirations and goals of the village has changed. I don't know if there's any reference to climate action and affordable housing in any detail in the old plans. So it really was time for a fresh up, and we collectively agreed that consolidating all of that into one document was the best approach to make sure that it happens and give some certainty to council, the community, and the applicant as this moves through its process. The sub-area plan tool itself, it lives kind of the net between an OCP and a rezoning. So what it has is it has the benefit of applying the broader stroke OCP policies in a site-specific context. So it responds directly to the site and it responds to it directly to an application. It's something that is proven to be very useful in other jurisdictions over the years. It really takes the type of work that's been done in the neighborhood concept plan. It makes it live by including it as a schedule to the OCP. It really does tie together a large body of complicated information, ideally in a logical sense. We've had some questions about the relationship to the official community plan. So the relationship is this document would be part of it. So council, as they amend an OCP, can amend the sub-area plan. The documents work in sync. So if in the context of the OCP review, something were to come up that would be applicable to this plan, we would fully expect that would be applicable to these lands as well. There's no reason why it wouldn't. And when you do an OCP update, there may be cause to update this plan. The sub-area plan process that we're doing, it's using the same inputs as the OCP update. The OCP update is working at its level, the 30,000 foot level, and it's looking at incorporating a lot of council work and community consultation over the years. We're using the same information set. So you will see reference to documents that have been created over the last couple of years, like the Affordable Housing Action Plan, like the Climate Action Plan. They work at different scales. And the direct question has come up, why wouldn't we wait until the OCP review is done? No, it makes sense. It's a logical question. But because they work at different scales, they can work in concert. The other sub-area plans, the big ones that I've done, a few of them in Squamish, all happen in the context of an OCP review, and they were symbiotic. They informed each other. Colin, who's leading the village's efforts on the OCP review, we talk a couple times a week, and we'll be talking more what we're hearing and what we're experiencing in this plan. So for example, the development permit area guidelines that we've drafted in this plan might inform some of the things like wildfire or other areas where the village doesn't have development permit area guidelines. They will work together for certain. But what's critical in this particular application, if this was a greenfield site on a hillside that had never been considered for development, I would probably be the first one standing here saying, let's get through the OCP review before we entertain it. But the reality is these lands have been included in the OCP for a number of years. They are zoned, they are part of the land bank. And quite frankly, I don't think the village, I can't conceive of a scenario where the village would be looking at contracting its available land, developable land in the context of the growth pressure in space. So for those reasons, staff are very comfortable moving these in concert and hoping that both of them are better by them happening concurrently. Running the two processes contemporaneously, I don't think either will provide significant outcomes that would make the other plan not work because they are symbiotic. If something comes out of the OCP review that is a new direction the village wants to take, that certainly can be incorporated into the sub-area plan. So at that point, we'll stop here. If there's any comments or questions, we can certainly dive into them now, or we can follow along.
So feel free to tell us as you talk on these ones, and you're going to address some of the questions later on in your presentation.
Yeah.
Some of the questions.
Yeah.
Just in terms of the process, Kevin, you talk about how the neighborhood concept plan has changed and, it's timely to review it now. How dynamic is this new sub-area plan? So this development on the hillside is going to happen over a number of years. And we see things change, whether it's housing needs, new technology, new concerns, new pressures. How does this get reviewed? How dynamic is this plan?
Mr. Mayor, through you, the difference with sub-area plans and OCPs is that normally the schedules to an OCP don't go through the same rigorous review that the OCP does every 5 or 7 years. One of the art of putting these together is you need to make sure that the plan includes enough specificity that it provides clear direction on the general nature of how this community is going to move forward, because it is an OCP document. It's not specific direction, but it retains enough flexibility that it can accommodate things like changes in housing needs and everything else. These do quite regularly get tuned up. Often it's the applicant sees an opportunity largely coming out of what the community might want to see, and they get tuned up. I've done 6 of these, and I don't think any of the first ones that were approved were the ones, all of them were amended to some degree. For the one for the university, I think we amended 7 times in 4 years because new ideas came. So it's not written in tablature. It's not forever the way it's approved, but it's not always the sort of thing. It in and of itself wouldn't have this kind of standard 5-year review process, because part of the idea is that it gives some level of certainty to everyone that wants to develop. But if something came up that became a village priority, it certainly could be applied. And when you're doing an OCP update, it's as simple as saying this policy direction applies to all lands in the village, including anything covered by a sub-area plan. So this will not freeze anything to the detriment of the village over time.
So it's not a bookmark review or tune-up, as you call it. Like I'm thinking about with this development in particular, how it moves its way through phases and benches upwards into the hills, and I'm just again considering how things change. We see it through the NHP. So it's not something we bookmark. We don't sort of set these tune-ups as we move through phases. It's more as conditions change and
right. Yeah. And again, these are a little bit different than OCPs because they are in response to a development application. This is not a 100% municipal driven planning exercise, right? The option of just pursuing with the rezoning would be a more standard course for a development application in this context. So we're kind of meeting halfway on some of these things, and it's not a contract. It's not anything the village will own the document. It can change it as well. But what will follow on the heels of the OCP and will be approved contemporaneously is the rezoning. So we need to make sure that a lot of the things that would be of real interest to council, perhaps time community matters, more properly addressed with zoning. And the zoning gives the deeper entitlements in the OCP designations.
Go ahead.
Through the mayor, so just trying to understand how the sub-area plan, I guess, relates or informs the rezoning. So, there's guideline policies, some conceptual plans. I guess question would be that when any zoning or rezoning applications go through, if the sub-area plan has been approved, do the zoning applications, they have to align with what's in the sub-area plan?
They have to be consistent.
Okay.
So again, it's about finding that right balance. You know, we could get down and create land use designations that say that each of these lots is going to be 5,312 feet square and it's going to have a house that's 2-story. We could do that. And it would kind of make it wouldn't really be providing information or direction to the zoning, which is why a lot of the policy statements, they're still fairly general. They've just been somewhat tweaked or they've been crafted largely. Like every OCP, you know, you go through this exercise and day to day you use the map. What's it does. So we've got some work to do there to see how much flexibility you want to retain at the village level. To see if something can shift between different housing types, because normally in the villages of OCP, you don't differentiate between housing types and residential. In this one, the land use plan, we will differentiate between housing types. And if someone were to come forward, we'll probably leave some flexibility in the plan that if there's a site that's not identified in the initial illustrative plan, it's, for example, for an apartment, but it makes sense for an apartment, there'll probably be some language that enables council to go through a rezoning without necessarily an amended plan.
Thanks. Will it also give us an opportunity that in the report, it talks about a certain amount of requirements for social housing, affordable housing. But it also says in there, it doesn't necessarily have to be on site. So will we take a look at the potential if the developer has another piece of property that they can develop with that type of thing? It's an exchange as long as it's done within a time period, what I'm more concerned about.
Yeah, so that raises a really interesting aspect of the sub-area plan. What it does more so than just a rezoning is that it takes into account the other things that are happening in the village, the other land that is in play. There is a very new significant rezoning application and development permit application that have a substantial amount of affordable housing. One might argue it's more than you need, potentially. So we can look at those things. So what we've written in the policy is that at the time of making a decision on affordable housing, council can make the best decision based on the knowledge they have in the community. It doesn't necessarily, this plan doesn't say they have to provide 15% market restricted units to find these goods. Now you might choose to do that at rezoning because the rezoning will likely be accompanied by a housing agreement. But if on this land, given its location, the cost to develop hillside lands is always more. If council were to take a different approach to affordable housing on this site, maybe in preference to another amenity that it may be able to get, realizing that affordable housing might be taken care of somewhere. It's giving you that flexibility in the plan. So again, we're more at a concept level, and we want to lock in certain things. You know, hillside design guidelines. We kind of want to lock those in, but there's certain things that we think at this stage in the sub-area plan, if they're left flexible, either with the first rezoning and the first housing agreement, if there is one, or in subsequent ones, council has some flexibility to respond. Thank you.
Follow up on that. So flexibility to respond, but still having laid out sort of certain baselines for how, you know, you say we don't put necessarily 15% affordable housing. I want to leave it flexible for the reasons you say, but I also want to make sure that we're asking for certain baseline. Oh, my thought.
Well, yeah, I mean, at this stage, and this is the sort of thing where you could ask us to take that away and look at whether we would include a policy that says 15% or equivalent or something. One of the things, again, we would take that away as an example, because we'd want to look at, okay, that's now become an obligation, and that obligation comes with a cost. And if the village is in a position where it didn't identify the need for on-site affordable housing, that cost would be, you know, maybe better served within a big amenity contribution or somewhere else. So we can certainly look at it. We will, the one thing I didn't mention as we move forward is we expect that staff and the applicants will drive additional changes to this plan when we get through to the muckier parts of the rezoning negotiations and amenity negotiations. Like that's it, but we can certainly flag that for today.
I'd like to explore it further down the road, just because I mean, comprehensive developments typically these days have a set requirement for affordable housing percentages and that sort of thing, so yeah, it's something I want to explore. I understand the flexibility and maybe that's provided somewhere else, or maybe through our housing needs assessment, we recognize at the time that what we do or don't need. But yeah, I definitely want to explore that a little bit further than that.
Through the mayor, can we just clarify what we mean by affordable housing? Because I'm hearing affordable housing in the context of potentially subsidized housing versus the general definition of affordable housing is somebody who can, 30% of your net income. And so are we talking market affordable housing or non-market affordable
I think
housing?
we're going to be talking about all of that. So we're going to talk about, when we talk about the diversity that's going to be provided up there, I think that's what we want, we as council want to bring forward to staff is, and again, this is why I'm asking the questions I just asked, because our housing needs assessment points us in a certain direction now. To Mr. Chalmers' point, that might point us in a different direction in 10 years when phase whatever is being built.
Yeah.
And maybe we have different needs. But I mean, identifying within the plan what affordable is and what the diversity is, I think is really important, the point you bring up. So they're below market, X amount of below market units are there, X amount of rental market units. That's the kind of diversity we'll dive into a little bit later, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that we're kicking around, I'll try to say this without sounding jaded because I'm not. But if the objective is to secure units under an agreement, that's one form of affordable housing that works very well in a lot of places. One of the things we've had a lot of conversation about, and I know Colin has brought pieces like this and we'll have more, is if the objective is really heads on beds, then things like lock-off suites and townhouses, multiple secondary suites, permission for garden suites, a lot of the things that we can't really do anywhere else. Like I look at the street that I live on in town, and there's a lot of people who live in suites that that probably aren't legal. There's multiple suites per house, but people live in them. So we're looking at because the contract method, the housing agreement method, and all of that is good. But there's other approaches as well that we want to look at. So we haven't got into detailed discussions, but we will at zoning about how comfortable council is looking at that type of flexibility. And that might help council calibrate if there is a percentage of what that percentage is, or maybe the percentage is shift where a certain percentage of the townhomes must have lock-off suites. And a lock-off suite in a townhouse is not going to rent for $5,000 a month. It's going to rent for something that's attainable more. So that's kind of what we're looking at this plan is we at a staff level, me personally, I have to say, think that the solution to getting people in housing that they can afford, the affordable housing model is sometimes in some places growing a little bit out of, it's becoming its own entity, and there might be other options here that accomplish the same goal in a much cleaner, simpler, cheaper way.
With your note that you put down there, I would like to see in addition to that where it either be on-site or off-site. So if we choose 15%, which is 25 units in the first phase, it can either be on-site or it can be exchanged for off-site within a certain period of time, though. I don't expect if we approve it today, that 15 years from now, they put it up. I mean, it's got to kind of coincide with the development, I think.
We know affordable housing, it has to be a central conversation to what we're doing here. And I know, and look over at Carolyn, and I know that she's frustrated because we haven't jumped into detailed discussions about affordable housing and amenities. And the main reason for that is up until a few days ago, we didn't know if this project was going to be able to sustain the offsites that might be required for it to even be built. And we certainly have no indication whether or not those offsite requirements would make it challenging for the project to remain viable and deliver the amenities and things that council expect. We're starting to get some comfort with that. So we're jumping into those discussions over time. Yeah, I'm so bad at jumping ahead of myself. I'm gonna stop. Get away. Steal my own thunder. Okay, is there anything further on that? Very part of the intro?
Yeah, just a process question. So if the SAP is approved, how does that affect the current zoning that is there? Because you're saying if we have the SAP in place, you'd still have to apply to rezone and it would have to be in accordance with this SAP, but could somebody, if the SAP is approved, could somebody still build according to the current zoning that's up there?
Yes.
Okay.
However, this is a concurrent OCP and rezoning application, so we'll bring them likely to you as a package. And again, I'll say it now because it makes sense and skip over on the slide. This application, the OCP, no, we're gonna make you wait.
Okay, that's good.
So now we're gonna talk a little bit about developing the Sudbury plan and some of the things that went into it. Again, this doesn't do justice to the amount of work that the applicants and staff have done over time, but how we got here, again, really critical to remember that this was not a municipally initiated planning study. The last effort, the 2007 NCP, was more of a provincial municipal First Nations involved policy, pure policy exercise, but this is being done in response to an application. So just like we would with any zoning or DEP application, when somebody makes an application to the village, we have to deal with it. And we work collaboratively with them to try and figure out the best path forward. And sometimes that changes plans, sometimes it doesn't. But we have to bear in mind that the municipality is not the author of every input into this plan, but we work with them on everything. And one of the first things we agreed on, I think, is that what's approved now is not the best solution for the lands. What someone could do, an owner could do right now is not over the long term, probably the optimal solution. And even though that wasn't necessary that they go through this level of OCP amendment, it is something that we agreed and encouraged very strongly. So the owners have agreed to it. They've agreed to fund the servicing models. And this is the bullet I need to wait for. So the OCP amendment will apply to all of the holdings that right now are deemed appropriate for development. It will include all of the holdings that have transferred from the province. And the language gets a little bit confusing in the plan, but in short strokes, there's 3 phases of development within their holdings that have been identified so far. The rezoning is only over the first 2 phases. And that's because the 3rd phase is the old gun range site. In the purchase of the land from the province, the owners have agreed that they will clean it. They will remediate it. But that's not for the faint of heart, that exercise. And there's still not a lot of clarity about to what standard and at what cost that remediation will happen. The remediation will happen, but what that might mean for future development, we're not presupposing and pre-zoning the land. So if this were to achieve the ultimate buildup that you're seeing in the plan, it will absolutely require one more major rezoning. So the application itself, nice thick binder, a lot of technical submissions about the land itself, the additional analysis that went into the land and the land form that drove some of the decisions around the land use. Really, it's a tightening up of what was approved before largely, and that's in response to natural environment attributes, topography. They put that all in a consolidated conceptual plan and then provided us a land rationale. So we did have a fairly extensive pre-application process. We've had a fairly engaged application process to date in putting together this plan. And consultation has been a part of that. Now, up until now, the consultation has been exclusively developer-led. It has now 3 interactions, and an interaction would be a consultation period where they may be meeting with trail groups, having a pop-up, and then having an open house. The comments that we're hearing throughout have been largely around making sure there's adequate housing diversity, concerns about traffic, concerns about trails, concerns about environment, and concerns about the amount of commercial. There's a sub-theme of comments about this project should not happen, period. And those are certainly going to be recorded in the consultation program that's provided to the village. They're not the predominant comment, but they are there, and it indicates to us that there's some more public consultation that needs to be done, likely led more by the village. So at the last open house on April 20th, the applicants gave a presentation. They hosted, they had their consulting professionals there to sit at tables. I know some council was in attendance. The map on the right is kind of an example of how they scrawled notes on maps. About 40 people attended. To date, there were 9 feedback forms and 4 comments were also sent to the village. Again, kind of replicating what we heard on what I just described on the last slide. We know traffic's going to be a concern. We know that housing, the housing options and diversity and what's the right type of housing is also a concern. And there were several comments, again, saying that this project should simply just not happen. And, those are all valid comments. We will be receiving a consultation report from the applicant. On April 20th, those staff gave an overview presentation, kind of mirroring the one we just gave you with a little more detail on what we're about to get into. And that kind of signified, at least in my mind, a bit of a transition, because now the municipality is taking a little more ownership of the plan. Additional consultation, I think, should be village led. Applicants will certainly have a role because they have a lot more intel and a whole team of professionals, but we'll talk at the end of the day a little bit more about what future consultation might look like and when the time would be right. So the sub-area plan preparation, so we took all of the inputs from the applicant submission. We did internal referrals and then some external referrals as council. It was before the last municipal election, but council did for our OCP amendment under section 475 of the act. Council identifies agencies that they would like to see the application referred to, and we've done the first round of those. And yeah, so we've taken all that information and we wrote a plan, and that's what we gave you. So the applicants provided us some sketch. We had some collaboration, and then at a point the municipality took over, and the words in the plan with some exceptions, but the words are mostly written in a village voice. So they're intended to represent the operations of the village based on what the proponent has provided. Any comments or questions on that part? Okay, I've been doing this like 25 years. We're actually like right on the minute for the first time in my career.
Took you 25 years to get there.
This could be the last shot. So if it's okay, maybe a quick little 5-minute break, and then we're going to start jumping into the more substantive parts of the plan. Less of me talking, more of you talking.
Recess for 5 minutes. Sure. Sorry.
Good.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so just stepping back, we're starting at part one. So it includes three important considerations of the plan, the vision statement, the sustainability statement, which seeks balance between the three traditional aspects of sustainability, and an introduction and purpose to the plan. Part two, which gets into some of the context. So it describes things like the location of the land, the context. I'm sure council doesn't have a lot of comment on that. The land use history, which we've talked about several times, including earlier this morning. Highlighted in that, of course, is the current OCP designation and the current zoning as a residential one neighborhood, and then gets into some of the ownership history. Again, not something you'd normally see at an OCP level, that level of description, but it's quite germane to the understanding of this plan and the site and its history. It then gets into some of the detailed site conditions, and this has been a really important driver of a lot of the changes that we're seeing in this updated iteration of the plan versus what exists in the earlier plan. And I don't know if everyone's seen this before, but I'm just going to run this for a minute or so. This was created by Akistic, which is now Placemark, the applicant's design consultant. But it gives you an example of the two plans overlaid. Lighter roads are old roads, the darker roads are the new roads, and it will take you on a bit of a tour of the site in 3 dimensions to show how this came about. So we'll just let this run for a second. The topography over the site. Yellow areas are the areas that are potentially contemplated for development. Green areas are green spaces, largely driven by topographic constraints.
That's the orange over yellow there.
Those are
Oh, that's the older in the line. I see.
conceptual road alignments, conceptual local roads. I actually just, okay. There's a different video that shows the two plans in comparison. So what you're seeing now is effectively the development concept for the site, draped over 3 dimensions. There were other iterations of a similar video that showed a comparison of the road alignments, but it was a little hard to read. So the relevance of the opportunities and constraints is that it looks at things like this, like the topography of the site, which features well in that video. It also looks at naturally significant areas, creeks, streams, setbacks from those, archaeological constraints. In this case, also site contamination is playing a significant role on the gun range site, which is why it's not proceeding now. And so all of those inputs and others, including contemporary approaches to neighborhood design and those things, went into layering the application that came in. But the opportunities and constraints is a really important thing because it tells the story of how we wound up where we did. This is not an overly complicated site, but it's not a simple site. So the applicant and staff have invested a fair amount of time getting to understand quite literally the lay of the land. And so just the last part before we get into comments. The other sub-area plan inputs. So the things that went into this, some of the key considerations were things like the population growth forecasts. We know that work is currently being tuned up. We know that there's housing needs work that's being reviewed currently. But there's a lot of those sort of things that we looked at, but one thing that we're pretty certain about is that the community is growing. The pressures for growth are coming, and how the village chooses to respond is a policy question. But we do see, we have used some of that, including work that the applicants provided by a very good demographer on the rate of growth and how this site may fit in. So the plan describes the proportion of the anticipated growth that this plan will be capable of absorbing over the years. We also looked at things like sustainable neighborhood design. What are the important things in creating a neighborhood, having appropriate amount of green space, having access to commercial either on site for local needs or adjacent in the downtown. And all of those things kind of went into the hopper and became inputs into the plan. We also, it doesn't say it in this section, but one of the things that's been instrumental in the review is we have done a review of all of the municipal policies that happened since the last OCP and last. Some things like affordable housing, which was like this prominent as it is now in terms of policy, climate action, active transportation. You'll see when we get into the policy section that all of those have been put into the plan as well, and policies being crafted around them. So in terms of the foundations of the plan, are there any comments or questions? Is there anywhere we've missed the mark? Anything that we think needs elaboration? And it doesn't have to be, but if there is, we would note it now.
Next part of this is where you get into a little bit more of the phasing and the housing and those comments. Okay. Good for now. Anybody have any questions?
Okay, moving along. So now we're going to delve into, we've kind of talked about what the site is, where the history of the site came from, how we got to this point. And now we're starting to move into establishing a policy and a vision for the site in OCP level language. To get there, there's a few important things. There's planning principles that are really important when you establish a site. And I'll just spend a second talking about what a principle means. You might notice that in some areas, things like climate action policy section is not 50 points long. It's not. And it doesn't need to be, because climate action has been something that's driven the policy consideration of the plan. So when we call something a principle, the idea is that those principles will run through all of the policies. We might not need to say them all literally, but when we have things like a requirement to provide a comprehensive trail network and multimodal access to the downtown, that we don't put that again in the active transportation or in the climate action policies. It's something that's been informed by the principles. So the principles are really important. And these came from two different sources. One, the OCP policies, we copied them verbatim, spelling mistakes and all, they're verbatim what's in the OCP. And the idea is that that's still the foundation of this plan. The second set of principles are ones that were written specifically for this site. So there are things like supporting First Nations reconciliation, prioritizing open spaces, responding to community housing needs, advancing climate action priorities, safe and resilient housing, model of hillside development, fiscally responsible and will benefit the community. So each of those has a bit of a descriptor in the plan, but those are the things that every policy in here will be able to track back and reflect directly to those principles. It's a really important consideration because that is truly the rationale behind everything else. Moving to part 5 of the plan, there's a brief description, because this is in response to an application, there's a brief description of the development concept. Which again, we are using an illustrative plan in this context. There is not any policy that directly says the land must be built just like this. So it's really important. The 2-dimensional land use plan, which is what will be approved and policy is based upon, doesn't really tell a story. It doesn't really give a good feel. It might work well in this room, but it doesn't work nearly as well when I go to the public. So an illustrative plan is really, really important. But I did want to say, just as a bit of a disclaimer, doesn't mean this is exactly what it's going to look like. In fact, we would expect that there'd be some opportunities to tweak and turn this a little bit. And really, when we head into the zoning, we'll probably look to have either 1 or 2 different variations based on the zoning permission created to again ensure that there's not a complete lock into this. But it's been really, really helpful. This is have a look at where the densities are concentrated, how the community might have its own node, however it responds and relates to adjacent development, the extent of the green space and what that green space could mean and what it could be. So this has been something that's been prepared by the applicants. I know that we would have a couple of tweaks to it just out of hand. But we're still not quite at a level of detail where we aspect of this. What this plan really will do is create this map. And this map again is different than an OCP map because it identifies not just residential, but different types of residential. That's the difference between the fee schedule and the sub-area plan schedule is we will take it down at least one grade further. How we describe each of those different land uses in residential, we don't know. But what we do know so far is that about 35 to 40% of the site will be used for residential development on the entire buildings. The community and commercial right now, again, we've got some work to do on figuring out exactly what that looks like. We'll do that through the zoning, but it would not be a land intensive part of the use. Parks, open space and trails represents about 48%. Again, the math here, we're dealing with bubbles and squiggly lines. We do not have calculations for each of these, but it works out to somewhere, 45 to 50% of this would be green space. And that would be areas that can't be developed. Some of them may be inaccessible. Some of them may be, there would certainly be a trails network and other things. But the intent is to try to balance the amount of residential density with like green spaces. In a number of different ways, and you'll see policies throughout. So moving in now into section 12, the land use policy, the overall approach here is to keep the policy simple, relatively simple and directive. Even though this is site specific, it doesn't, where the approach taken so far, and this is subject to change, is that the policies are clear and provide the appropriate amount of direction without being so prescriptive that council doesn't have maneuverability through this zoning and future zonings. The general land use policy, what it does is so section 12.1 is it gets into the land use, and we need to do some more definitional work. We will about exactly what some of those uses mean, some of the details, and that's where that symbiotic relationship with the zoning exercise in the sub-area plan. We know there will be some tweaks there. Break that then into kind of three general categories. So sections 12.2 to 12.4 address natural environments and hazards, an important consideration on this site. It does create some protection policies. So land in excess of 40% slope is not appropriate for development at all. Land in excess of 15% is considered hillside, and hillside is an important word in this document and in the development permitting guidelines. It talked about the preservation of green spaces and parks, open space and parks. The policy in that section, it raises a couple of interesting opportunities and prospects, is with the partnership with Blue Lot Nation and some of the opportunities that may exist there, some different approaches to ownership and stewardship of park space is something that could be entertained. But the idea is that another requirement policy is that every door would be within 250 meters of an open space or trail connection. Normally, in cities, the metric of 400 meters is considered a 5-minute walk or less. And so we're about 250 meters. So everybody would be a minute or two from an open space. So it's about, again, that's partially the community character. It fits a lot of the ethos of this place, that the open space isn't just there for show, it's people are connected to it. What this level of plan doesn't show is the more urban or neighborhood parks, community gardens, playgrounds, those sort of things. Those will come, those will happen. We know that for sure. We may be able to go a step or two further in this plan and describing them, but we're not quite at that scale of detail yet where we're saying that this 2 acres is a community park or a neighborhood. And then trails network, we know is a really important consideration. The policy so far is there's additional work that's happening now with some of the trail users groups and making sure that we have a comprehensively planned trail network. We know there'll be some alteration to the trails that have grown there over time. But we do know that before this project moves forward, there will be a very clear understanding of how the relationship between the development and the trails work. The objective is to provide a range of trails and a range of trail types. So if there's a cool single track mountain bike trail, it's not going to be replaced with a 3-meter wide gravel trail. We're matching experience and the trail type and experience throughout is the objective. again, we're setting the table for that. We don't have every answer to it yet, but the plan would certainly obligate that to happen as we move through the next stages. The residential policy. This sets a few clear targets. The overall development would be a maximum of 450 units, which is kind of on par, a little bit less than, in fact, some of the initial neighborhood concept plan work, but it's consistent with the current OCP. So this is not a significant expansion or increase in density or number of units there. And the rationale for that is that there's traffic work, there's servicing things, there's been planning for those for roads and utilities that have assumed a certain level of development, and this is matching that. It's more a reallocation of the types, moving away from a larger single family presence to something that includes like small lots and multi-family. It sets some policy around interface housing, so we recognize there are existing neighbors there in phase one of this development and some other adjacent streets. So it's looking at how those transition between each other using green space and housing type. Looking at some affordable housing introductory policies. One of the moves that we'd be recommending to council is that, and this is becoming increasingly common, is that the density does not include anything that's registered as an affordable housing by housing agreement. So, again, I don't think we're advancing a fine line between 450 and 500 in terms of the number of units and capacities. So we may look at, and this would not be set in this plan, but we would look at the option to exempt from density counts and units that are a type of affordable housing palatable to council. Usually that would be market restricted. We're almost through this part. This is the part that I expect to talk about for a bit. Commercial and community use policy. Really what this part does, there's a fairly modest amount of neighborhood service and commercial that's proposed. That could grow with some community uses. The word daycare has come up. There's, it's not an easy nut to crack right now with some of the changes that are happening in the daycare world. But as we move through the zoning, we'll be looking at some neighborhood service and commercial at a minimum, probably a minimum of provide some, and then an opportunity to enhance the commercial uses, likely in a centrally located area. One of the things that we've chosen so far to include in the policy is that the commercial would not be a destination type commercial. So the idea is that it would be intended to serve the neighborhood, not to create another draw for people from the downtown or other places. So that sort of language would inform the types of uses that we'd allow by design, probably getting closer to the corner store cafe type definitions than a general retailer or significant other commercial draw. So one other thing that we'll hit on really quickly here. Before we conclude the policy discussion is the hillside development policy in 12.8. And this is that page. Hillside development policy, council invested a lot of energy in looking at how to resolve some of the issues that happen with hillside development and learned a number of lessons from other developments. And what we're trying to do here is make sure that all of those concerns with hillside development are addressed well in advance. And so the village has created a hillside design guideline, which has a number of different aspirations that will be used as part of this. There will be a requirement for some demonstrating compliance with some of the values, but that's not really a design spec. It's not written in the development permit area guideline. It's kind of a long inventory of things that ought to be considered in hillside development. Great piece of work that has in role. What we tried to do is translate that into development permit area guidelines that council will use to regulate the development of the hillside as the first alteration of land. So council is aware that we've been doing that with Sunstone of late. The later phases of Sunstone, before they disrupt any land, they have been getting development permits. A lot of them are minor development permits issued by the director of planning. But the idea is that every alteration of land will have to meet a very specifically written set of development permit area guidelines regarding hillside development that we'll talk about in a little bit. And just for the purpose of the plan, we're considering 15% slope to be hillside. So again, that's fairly general. But really, it's a low bar. We're considering most of this stuff to be a hillside state and not to go through that level of review. And sustainability and energy efficiency, one of the things that we do with plans like this is there's often better, more comprehensive bodies of work specific to a topic, like in this case, climate action. What this plan really does is it defers and says you must meet the climate action work of the day. There will never be a point in time with any policy project in any municipality where you can freeze everything, finish all the work and put it into one document. This doesn't work like that. So we know that there's certain other pieces that are still emerging, like climate action, like some of the active transportation work where we've reflected it. It's here, but it doesn't have a 2 pages worth of policy because we're going to rely on the other work that's still emerging. We are going to look at some other things too, like promoting water conservation and looking at a different approach for dealing with that. We've got some water information recently. We know that the village uses a certain amount of water and this development might be better. And that might look at things like alternates to landscaping, reducing the amount of lawn, reducing the amount of ornamental grass or ornamental plantings. We're not going quite as far as xeriscaping, but there's ways that we can reduce water consumption because we know that's going to be an increasingly valuable resource going forward. And then again, higher level, but still promoting green buildings. I'm not making direct reference to step code or anything at this stage, but we expect there'll be more discussion about some of those obligations through the development agreement as we move through the zoning. Okay, that's a lot. So I apologize, but that's about how it goes. So we can now move into any comments or questions that council or committee of the whole may have. I think I need to share the screen.
Comments, questions? That's correct.
Yeah, thanks very much. And this is the area that I've got a lot of notes on because it comes in your report. It says any non-market affordable housing provided on site and secured through housing agreement will not be included in the calculation of maximum density. So when I look at that, and I look at the potential to put a lock off or suites or duplexes now to have a suite and that type of thing, I guess I'm looking that puts the 450 total units, but it could end up being 500 or 600 residential living spaces.
That's potential. What we're looking at now, the definition of unity is something that comes in zoning. We would need to crack that nut for sure. One of the things when you look back at the affordable housing policy, though, is that affordable housing, you're looking at agreements we can provide to find it. And the bar for those are pure non-market affordable housing units. I don't think that the village would be securing those type of agreements on a building by building basis. So that would be more if it was contributed as a floor on an apartment, for example, that might not be included in the overall calculations. And that's I think we're picking that up from other municipal policy. I think one of the things that we need to look at with this one, and I tipped it earlier, is there's going to be forms of housing that are attainable and more affordable in this plan, we hope, that will not require the level of regulation like a service neighboring. I mean, you're not, I don't think the village has an interest in getting into housing agreement, getting into housing agreements for suites or block off suites or those sort of things. Like that's really, there's different ways you can provide affordable housing. I think what we're hoping to find here is one that's a little less cumbersome than what you would do in an apartment building with title restrictions and so on. How we define that exactly? I don't know. We're not there yet, but we'll certainly look at, we'll make a note of reviewing that exemption. Yeah.
I guess just on that note is, I understand your comment or your point about, we have limited resources, being able to enter into housing agreements for every law off suite, something like that would be massive. But maybe this is, I'll actually tie this to my question about the principles. I'm wondering, and maybe this is a question more so for the table too, is if there's any interest in seeing a principle that maybe reflects that a priority here is that we're trying to build homes for locals. I see it, I see a lot of language about affordable housing, but I just recognizing that there is, you know, there is a certain portion of housing in this community that is going for it's vacation homes and things like that, which I think is partially contributing to we've got limited housing stock. It's going to be contributing to the affordability crisis. So I'm just saying, I mean, whether or not we can actually tie that into any specific policy, but looking at saying, you know, a priority for us in development projects is that we are developing housing, or, you know, our priority is developing housing for residents and people who are going to live and work here. And because I guess my concern is if we don't have anything that, you know, is as strict as housing agreements, I understand that we don't have the resources, but also hoping that we're going to put in a bunch of different things might lead to lower prices. I don't know how feasible that is. I mean, the rental market up here is so tight. So I recognize that that's a very difficult thing, and
Well, there's a number of considerations that we can take into that comment. One, we can't control who lives here. We can't control who purchases a place. Like, those are things that literally you cannot do. But one of the things that you can think about when you look at this project, and again, you look at it in the context of every other development that's happening in town. And, you know, we have some of the benefit of seeing what's come through the doors recently and the range of different housing types. Liquidity in housing is a healthy thing. And, you know, my experience in Squamish largely was that a lot of new development was consumed by people who lived in town. And people who were maybe moving out of their townhouse and climbing a property ladder into their first single detached home. Or the townhouses were being filled by people who moved in. And that was all happening just through natural market dynamics. What can be a problem is when a marketplace doesn't have any liquidity. So the people moving out of their townhouse are now they're not moving, so selling their townhouse is available for someone to move in as a first-time home buyer and buy used stock. There's always going to be some challenges with calibrating new development to meet all housing needs, because it simply doesn't, it can't, right? Purchasing a new house is different than purchasing an old house in a lot of ways. And that's one of the things that we've been thinking about and talking about in some of the housing needs stuff is making sure there's an appropriate amount of liquidity in the marketplace, that people are moving out of the homes once they get in. People can move up or down the property ladder however they need to suit their financial situation or their family needs or those sort of things. So the short story with that is that there is no one type of house that is for a person in particular. It's that type of housing that my family needs is probably very different than the type of housing that Scott's family needs or Colin's family needs. Like, that's the reality of it. We're also not going to solve every housing problem one side ever. It's just like, even at a neighborhood scale of this is a bigger one, it's a big opportunity, but it's 400 acres, but it's on a hillside. There is 100% no denying the reality that hillside development costs. It also often has views, which doesn't matter what structure you put on it, those views are going to generate value. So we have to be trying to pay relatively close attention to what we can control and manage and factor in, because we can't manipulate the market to the extent that we would like to. I think there's also these problems. So where does that leave us with some of these discussions? Like, housing agreements are going to factor into the community very importantly. We've already seen several projects that have advanced quite far down that track. And we know that there's other projects coming that you will have very appropriate proper use of a housing agreement to control the rents of an apartment building over a long term, over the life cycle of the building. That's really what that tool is for. That tool is not designed for the municipality to regulate what an individual homeowner can charge for a suite most of the time. So there's the two aspects, and to the extent that both of those fit onto the site, we're not really sure yet. Like, there probably could be a role for a housing agreement in something like a more conventional apartment format. It may be an entire building, it may not be. Again, we want to make sure that when we look at the housing continuum, if we zero in on one part of that and try to direct all of the housing there, it kind of disrupts the matrix. Like it doesn't work all of the time, because if we're only providing one type of housing, then you don't have that market liquidity that's necessary in the community to be healthy. So as I said at the outset, we know there's a huge interest in affordable housing. We know that this site has an opportunity for housing diversity that's not reflected on the Osterlitz plan and those things. And this is great feedback for us to take with us. And it's one that I really hope the community as a whole puts in a resolution to us to really take a deep dive in exploring the diversity of housing that can be fit on the site and put it in context with the rest of the community, because we'll be doing that work anyways. And it's really, if it was an easy nut to crack, somebody would have figured it out by now. There's, a province full of very smart people who really have not been able to get that right balance. And I'm quite convinced it goes back to, even you look at places like the city of Vancouver, one of the best planning regimes on the planet. They've never had the right balance between office and residential in the downtown. It's always been a pendulum. It's swung one way, we're going to convert all the offices to residential, and now it's swinging the other way, and then it swings back. And we're going to have, given the scale of this community, we're going to have what we consider very small projects elsewhere have a significant manipulation in the housing market. If council were to approve a couple of apartment buildings in close succession, that's all of a sudden an overthought supply scenario likely in one housing type. And that'll be reflected in the values of those sites. It'll make things a lot more liquid. And the same thing could happen if council approved a large subdivision. And that was on an upper end of the affordability spectrum. That will provide an oversupply in one area, and it will create liquidity as people move up or down between those two different points. So we don't have I wish I could give you an easy answer to your question, because it's a good one. If I think of it, I'll let you know, but yeah, it's going to be a balance. And there's no, quite honestly, we can't find the right answer, because I don't know that there is one.
That's an email.
Through the mayor. Thank you, Mr. Chalmers. I have a question about just the consultation process with the nation. It's been acknowledged that this is a great opportunity for authentic reconciliation. And I think the consultation process with the village has been really positive. And I'm just wondering about the consultation with Lillooet and how we can make that as robust and meaningful.
The discussion so far, there's a few different streams of consultation that are happening in the ownership group, and this one is, again, it's not unique, but it's a good opportunity to address some of the issues around reconciliation from a different flank than normally would happen through a development application, because Lillooet Business Group is a development partner in this, owners of the land and development partner. Now, what we've done so is we've done the standard referral consultation with Lillooet Nation, as we normally have. The applicants have done consultation both here in the village and with Lillooet Nation, and are expected to continue to do that. So we have not done any targeted public consultation. I think what we will do is we move forward, we'll make sure that the consultation through future public engagement, the future public engagements, we'll make sure that that's made as open and as broadly available as possible. I do know, and I don't want to put words in the applicant's mouth, but I know from our discussions that they certainly have been talking about their continued consultation role directly with Lillooet Nation membership. So there's a lot of pieces moving on, but quite frankly, we're still moving through what has been a lot of the more conventional consultation approaches with Lillooet Nation.
Okay, so just so I'm understanding correctly, so the open house, the most recent open house that we had in Pemberton, which was well attended, would that sort of forum, that sort of forum be considered to take place in Ullage, or somewhere like that?
I believe similar sessions have happened, and I understand they'll continue to happen. Look into that. Yeah,
And,
Yeah, so-
and it's, sorry,
Again, the dynamic is a little bit different because the applicant is a corporation owned by by First Nations governments. And they're doing some level of consultation on different levels because I guess it's analogous to when the district of the oceanfront plan, they were the owners of the land and it was being managed by a corporation. And I was doing the planning work, but wasn't on the corporation, and all of it gets a little bit cumbersome, but they're consulting on a couple of different levels. The consultation is happening on behalf of Village of Pemberton government because you're the government agency responsible for the land use approvals and allocation of land use. The land is owned in fee simple. So it's owned by a corporation that's a subsidiary of a First Nations government, but it's not being treated at a staff level any different than any other application because it's a company making an application for development. But what's happening on the Lil'wat Nation side is that the business group and the proponents there have been actively consulting Lil'wat Nation membership. Not so much, I guess, towards land use approval, but because the government owns a corporation. And just like any government that owns a corporation or any government moves, I'm sure there's going to be a range of opinions. The extent to which those apply to land use is really what we would be focusing on. And I know there's other considerations that are likely at play, but we're working towards the land use process.
okay. Yeah, I don't want to flog a dead horse, but I guess because it's in the sort of vision statement, we're very clear that it is an opportunity for reconciliation and sustained economic growth for the nation, which would have a very positive impact, hopefully, on the community. And I would, so because of that, I would be very curious about the community's thoughts on this development, as they're going to be the primary. In some ways, they're going to be not the primary beneficiary, but they're going to be beneficiaries of it. And I would just be very curious to hear the feedback of regular community members in Lil'wat.
We have a process section at the end. We'll make a note of it there. Certainly, it is interesting. It's a balance that I'm sure will emerge over time.
Okay.
But we are also being quite respectful of the different processes and the different purposes for which they're being undertaken.
Mhm.
And the reconciliation, it's a big loaded question that we're still working through. At this point, at a staff level, staff are working with the applicants as we would any applicant. We're moving it through a conventional land use planning approval process. And we haven't, just like we wouldn't with any other applicant, go address concerns with their shareholders. We at a staff level are not doing that, but it does raise, again, another opportunity, and it's reflected throughout the plan to bring reconciliation onto the ground, but in terms of how the development looks, perhaps how green spaces are managed. We haven't even started the amenity conversations, but there could be things there. So there's a lot of opportunity emerging out of the plan, but there's also things happening at a level that are not appropriate for staff to be delving into as part of this process. So yeah, it's an ever shifting dynamic that we can certainly talk about in the process section at the end.
Any last question, then I'll come back to Councillor Scott. Just on that, just to pick up on Councillor Nightingale's point too, the opportunity to explore things like signage and educational pieces and that sort of awareness through the development would be great. In terms of the housing diversity, is that something we're going to look at in the phasing in the next stage, or should I make comment on that?
That would be the right.
Okay, so when we talk about the housing diversity, one of the things that I've looked at in the plan and in previous presentations, or something I would like to see, is that the affordable and mixed housing is not set out in separate phases. In other words, we don't do phase one, X amount of single family homes, phase two, townhouses, phase three, we go into apartments. Personally, I'd very much like to see the neighborhoods, each bench and each neighborhood contain that diversity as opposed to having separate phases of that diversity. So in other words, you walk down your street and you walk from your single family home past the fourplex, past the townhouse, past an apartment building, whatever it be. So that, and I know geography and topography will play a role in that. But making sure that the diversity, I'd like to see the housing not split into very distinct phases and distinct areas. For a couple of reasons. First of all, so that the different levels of housing are being provided as the phases go on. We don't know what the market will dictate and how long a gap the proponents might decide to wait between phase 1 and phase 3, for instance. So to ensure that different levels of housing are being constructed all the way through, as well as just to build truly complete neighborhoods with varying demographics and not separating those sorts of housing. So that's something I would definitely like to see for Britain.
Certainly, we'll take that away. Just the preliminary thoughts. It will really depend on how defined diversity. And the simple reality is if a portion of the affordable housing is going to be built in an apartment, that's going to happen in one shot. Now, if we are looking at enhanced provisions for multiple secondary suites or fourplexes or threeplexes or what have you, those will certainly can be incorporated from day one, and we can look at how that works. But yeah, that's something we haven't spent a lot of time yet on the temporal consideration of this. Like we've of course have been thinking about it having a 15-year build cycle and sort of things. But I think our first step will be to see how comfortable we are in stretching those diverse housing options and what tools are available to make sure that they happen. So,
Yeah, I just want to see it happen, not for the social reasons.
Yeah.
That it's not density housing over there. You know, the old models that we have here where our neighborhoods, oh, there's the nice neighborhood on the hill, there's the less nice neighborhood over on that side. You get to live there, I get to live here. I want to see that mixed diversity and again, I want to see it supplied as we move through the phasing and not have to wait for it.
and I think that aligns very well with where we're going, because if we do the same thing, we'll get the same result. I think what we're going to be asking council to do as we move through the zoning is really test some tolerances on how far you want to go in allowing diversity and how that sits relative to other things like parking or density numbers and those sort of things. Again, the more creative we get, the more likely we are to achieve that, because the conventional model and the conventional approach to development and conventional financing would see one apartment built at some point, probably later on, because it's gonna the vertical development is expensive, and I think we're trying to do a lot better with this.
Yeah, awesome. As it applies to our housing needs assessment, it shows what our gaps are, whether there be a missing middle or whatever we're missing there continues. I'll come back after. Councilor Craddock, you go ahead.
Thank you very much. When we talk about the climate action plan and the community amendment contributions, when will we get into those?
The community amenity conversations are. It's just walking onto the dance floor maybe now, where we're not really there yet. Because again, the way development works, there's a reality of the cost of doing development, and on a hillside, those costs are what they are. And there's a forecastable amount of revenue that comes out of it. And what's remaining, I'll remember we had this conversation with the amenity policy, there is always some available money that could be allocated to different things. What we've had to do is try to rule out that all of that money and more would go to offsite services, because if it needed massive offsite services to even be viable, the project may not proceed, or it would proceed, but the pot for amenities are much lower. Because what we can't do is we can't say, well, this project is running right on the thin line, and we're going to take an extra $20 million of amenities, because the project simply won't proceed. So where we are now is we're getting a better handle on what the servicing requirements will be. And so we get an understanding of how much of that pot can be allocated to offsite services and improvements. There will be some, we know that for certain. Things that benefit the community that may not be conventional amenities. And those are usually things that the developer gets some benefit from and the community gets some benefit from. we will actually assign a percentage of that benefit. It's not a scientific exercise, but that's what we do. And then we will enter into the pure amenities. These are the things that are truly give back to the community that usually bring the developer some level of satisfaction, either on site or being the contributor of something to a community. And we're just starting to brainstorm some ideas around how that may allocate and what that might need in terms of the amenities that are coming back.
And going forward, like the CACs, are we gonna do those on each phase level, or are we looking at the full site? Because I guess I'm looking at things like we're creating a whole new community.
Yeah.
And that's going to impact fire services and equipment. It's gonna impact the vehicles for doing the parks. And I'm just wondering, like, those are things that will be, if it's not provided or partially provided or considered, that's a cost to the community. And you know, you just said that this stuff you're just getting into, and I'm curious if we can't ask everything from the obviously developer because it won't go ahead. I mean, I know the cost of doing that type of thing, but I'm just wondering, I'll put that kind of stuff down, street clearing and equipment for doing that it creates a whole new amount of equipment and things we need in the community to look after.
Yeah, so we'll be doing. We'll be doing, I'm gonna call it a financial model just as a speaking point. It's not going to be a detailed socioeconomic cost assessment because we simply just don't. We don't need to do that. What we'll be looking at is some of those things over time. We know that there's taxation on the residential properties, but we know that taxation probably doesn't cover its own costs, right? And we know that every dollar residential tax taken in, you know, most municipalities have to offset by commercial and industrial to keep the taxes reasonable. We get that. So we know there'll be a tax revenue coming to the village. We also know that there's an opportunity to deliver things that the village might not otherwise be able to deliver. And some of those we expect to be amenities or other improvements. So sometimes things like if the village can secure a significant amenity that it couldn't otherwise provide, but part of that cost is additional snow clearing and everything else, we'll look at that and see if that deal makes sense to us. What you will see with this application, which I don't know that the village has ever seen, is when we get through all of this analysis, when we come in with the zoning, you'll be getting a very clear term sheet that outlines every offsite obligation, every commitment the developer has made. If they say, yeah, we're going to use low flush toilets, that'll be on there. And that will be turned into a development. And so all the amenities, offsite services, and obligations of the developer will be in that agreement, and they'll be assigned by phase. Because there is a reality of development that usually the most expensive part is the first phase, governing all of the infrastructure and everything else. And if we look at the things that are coming back to the village, like amenities and everything else, if we assign them all to the first phase, that's fine. But in terms of viability, the amount of those would go down. If we look at some that may be spread over time or backloaded, we're going to be looking at other financial models around DCCs and DCC for vendor agreements and other things to make sure. The bottom line is the developer will take care of its own. The developer will make sure that all the works and services and amenities they agree to are paid. That's an absolute. Some of the other things where we long-term obligations, you know, we've heard some comments around things like healthcare and police and schools and those things. Those run through their normal channels. You know, the village doesn't provide a lot of those services, but the school board annually will sit there and forecast what they expect for development. We'll have a really clear roadmap if this plan were to be approved about how long it would take and how the phasing would happen and think when things would come online. That becomes just more useful information in those forecasts. So we're not there yet by any stretch, but we've been starting to populate some of that recently with some.
And then if I may.
Here, I got other people waiting too.
Oh, go ahead.
Follow up.
No, go ahead.
Councilor Nightingale, go ahead.
Thank you. Just sort of to branch off of the comment about infrastructure and schools, that's what I'm curious about. How does that work if, you know, you look at, there's all the development going on in Sunstone, and if this goes, we know that Signal Hill is already pretty full. And if the school, I think it's in phase 2 where the school is supposed to be built. What's the relationship between this sort of thing and the school district? Because we're seeing in a lot of communities across the province that housing is, you know, ramping up, but things like schools aren't keeping up. So I'm just curious how that all works.
Sure. So in general terms, every year the school board looks at what its requirements and its needs are. They do a forecast based on growth and occupancy levels at schools. The village is getting a new elementary school, K through 8. So
The French school,
the French school,
K to 12.
K to 12. So the village is already getting a new school funded through the French school district. And this site in particular, we have a letter from the school board that they're not going to be requesting a school site on this site. And that doesn't surprise me. It's not a centrally located site. It would not be an optimal location for a school in any event. And the density up there, although the number is big at 450 units, that's nothing close to commanding a school site. So what normally happens, and we've already done the first round of referrals to agencies, including the school board. We send them a referral and they identify any needs that they may have for education facilities. And that they may have, that swings a lot of different ways. Their school board has been a little bit renowned for requesting sites be set aside or land be allocated that ultimately won't get built as a school. There's a number of them up and down the corridor. In this case, because they haven't asked for a school site, there is not one provided at any stage. So they must, through their models, probably have included the construction of the new French school, the liberation of a lot of the Signal Hill space as a result of that. It's their job to do it, quite honestly. We're not experts in it. And it's the same with health and a lot of other things. The municipality, if you don't provide the service, you just provide the information. And I'm working on other projects currently where the school board has said, yeah, we might need a site. So they've got a site set aside. They may use it, they may not, we don't know. But that's not the case in this one.
Thank you. Maybe that's a further council conversation. Because I have some more questions around that, but I think I can direct those to Mayor Richmond at another time. My other question, it's just a similar, do you know off the top of your head what the percentage of unusable land is in the site? Just simply can't be used?
Well, it depends on the parameters you put around to make it unusable.
Can't be housing and buildings can't be built on it. So I'm not talking about the open space. I'm just talking about can't be developed in the traditional sense.
Well, I mean, one school of thought would be that the entire site could be developed. It would just require more land alteration. And what we've said is we've applied policy approaches that say we do not want to alter the land beyond a certain level, and we've chosen 40%. I don't know what percentage of the site is in excess of 40%. Certainly, if you look at the footprints of the current development and the footprints of the new development, an effort has been made to minimize the footprint of developable land. But I don't know the percentage that would be considered undevelopable under the policy we propose. We can get that though.
That'd be great. Thank you.
That's great, back to you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Under climate action, and I don't know how that's going to come in, but some of the things I was kind of looking at are things like, where do we start talking about if we want to climate action, like something as simple as everybody has a white roof, or instead of concrete or asphalt driveways, they have to have that stuff that's got, you can grow grass in, which retains water. We don't have as much runoff. Where does that come into the conversation down the road?
Well, elements of that could come into the development permit area guidelines for the types of development that will require a development permit. So single attached housing duplex doesn't trigger a development permit requirement unless it's small lot. And there's small lot guidelines in here. And usually a small lot, you're dealing with subdivision matters more than building matters. There are certain tools that the village could look at. A covenanting approach for something like that might work better than a policy approach if we were looking at some of those kind of blanket restrictions. But certainly we can look at building more of those considerations in. We have built in, for example, a shift in how landscaping happens on multifamily sites and commercial sites. If council wants to carry that a step further, that would be done by covenant through part of the rezoning process. So what we will do is we'll flag that for now.
Yeah, no, it's really not under the sub area plan, but it's more into the development stage, I guess.
Well, it is, but you see, what we want to capture are some of these things so that we have the ability to compel them later. So a natural sequence for a requirement like that might be that we plant the seed in the sub area plan and suggest that the policy would be that this have higher than industry standard climate action policy. Then through the rezoning, the land development agreement would obligate the owner to prepare a climate action plan before the first building permit. And then before the first building permit, they would do something specific to what's our subdivision. They do something specific to what's being created. So again, we're planting seeds at this stage, and there's multiple ways that they can be carried through the process. And something like that, I've got a note of it to figure out the best way to handle it, but.
Jumping all around here, but in terms of the active transportation and trails, you know, I know there's discussion around it, and active transportation is being very much considered, and I know, I think that some of the specifics around this will come out later, but maybe just in terms of the planting the seed or setting the table, you know, it's a hillside development. It's right next to downtown, but it's on a hill. So I think the majority of people will most likely not be carrying their groceries up and down the hill by foot. I know there's discussion allowance and how we connect with the trails, but I would very much like to see, as the plans come forward, an exceptionally robust active transportation plan. We see such a changing landscape here, and we're behind here in our rural community compared to the city. Go down some urban centers and everybody's riding around on e-bikes and the two-wheel things, and they're all so. We're up on the hillside, we know, and then I want to get some other traffic discussion later, but we know that traffic is a concern for the community. We know we want to limit cars coming in and out of the neighborhood for environmental reasons, for neighborhood quality of life, all that stuff. So I just am going to want to see really robust active transportation allowances, thinking ahead to the future, not what we've got right now. But recognizing that with that development in 20 years, I foresee personally people doing in and out on a lot of different types of electric vehicles. So that and similar to that is shuttle stops. There's no transit allowances in this plan, which I don't know that we want to put a transit bus up there, but I think we want to consider pullouts and shuttle stops, be it for just collecting people, handy dart type service, that sort of thing for the future. I would definitely like to see those allowances made.
Certainly true. We will be getting to those in the next two sections from then.
Okay.
But yeah, could you do one? Great comments.
Councilor Nightingale, is that a new hand or is that your old hand?
That's a new hand.
All right, look fresh. Go ahead.
Actually, you took some of the words out of my mouth, because that's what I was going to speak to next. But I just did want to go back to Mr. Chalmers. You mentioned somewhere at the beginning that they're actively researching and looking into the secondary access to the site, and I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
They're actively looking into the secondary access. The original plan had significantly more development happening up and down the backside of the hill to where Pemberton Meadows Road and coming down and connecting in. That is certainly a road that would pose massive engineering challenges to construct at an exorbitant cost, and would pose an ongoing maintenance issue for the village over time. So fairly early on, we think we collectively agreed that looked really good in 2 dimensions. It does not look very pleasing in 3 dimensions. So what's happened now is that there are potential options that are being explored, and they've provided several of them. I actually haven't really reviewed them yet myself to see how we can provide at least a minimum emergency access for this number of units. Because this number of units is kind of starting to push some of the threshold for a single access. We typically don't like to see them of that length. There are other ways to achieve the equivalent of a secondary access that have been done in many places, and that's effectively either boulevarding the main road or somehow in some other way separating it. So there is internal looping on a lot of the road systems inside the development, but it's the main access we need to resolve. We know it needs to be resolved, and we haven't quite found the right balance yet. And the balance may rest in boulevarding if we don't know yet.
Thanks. So those sorts of conversations will, I mean, because I'm very concerned about it. It's a big concern of mine, that transportation piece. Those conversations are going to happen again at a later date.
Yeah, and in the policy, it says right now is that the applicant, there must be a safe and reliable form of access to the property. I think it's specific in the second access. But we're not quite at the transportation policy yet.
Okay.
We're heading that way. So.
There's a
Thank
lot, just to read that, from my own point of view, there's a lot of concern around the community about the traffic in and out, and from an emergency standpoint, recognizing that traffic study can be done in terms of what Eagle Drive can handle, and I get all that, but in terms of emergency, one in, one out to that community is.
Yeah, and it is with us as well. We've asked the applicants to come up with options to solve it, and that will certainly come back. As the traffic generally, that's in the next section, and I'm moving to that if you want.
No, I think you got a few more questions. Go ahead, Councilor.
The difference between, on the schematics, we've got community, nature park, neighborhood park, and natural area. So I guess what's the difference between community, nature park and
I don't know. I mean, we're not really quite at that level of specificity yet. What we will have, and there's the layer I think is still being created. We have a parks, open space and trails plan that right now is kind of just one big piece. I imagine we'll see that broken down as the site plan evolves. We have not at a staff level been asking for them to continue to provide levels of detail on the site plan until we start getting the policy staff through. We're at a staff level, we're trying to create policy that responds to the application in many ways, but is not driven entirely by it. Right. So we haven't written policy saying, this is going to be a single detached lot. We're not, because we want to make sure that we have a good balance. The next phase is that we'll start getting into more and more details as we test out the plan. And that usually happens in zoning. So I imagine the zoning schedule will be a little bit clearer, and then the land development agreement will have a schedule that very clearly lays out which parks will be developed in some manner and what will be in those parks in a general sense, and an obligation to develop and build them at a certain time in the development process.
I guess my one comment here is that if it looks like there's some areas within the development area that are being left as natural area, they're not going to be developed. And I think from, if we talk about an environmental point of view, that type of space and planning for that type of space is really important. We're building up the side of the mountain, there are animals up there. And so providing those spaces where, it's not a managed park, it's, I don't know if there would be any consideration about, managing trails through that area, because I think it's something to consider is trying to, within our communities, preserve some of those.
The way I understand it is that the areas that are green borders or that are entirely green will be naturalized areas.
Okay.
A lot of the other parks you're talking about would be either on the fringe of those between development and the natural area, because again, you'll see we've got some pretty robust wildfire protection.
Yes.
The general approach is that things like neighborhood parks, playgrounds, tot lots, those sort of things would be more centrally located so that they have a bigger catchment area. It would be a little more developed in character. So we'll get there. And some of these things, like we will likely state in the plan, and we have to some degree, and will enhance the aspiration to have these different park experiences. Some of them you won't see the design detail to until the development, but you'll know that it's going to be a centrally located park. It'll be fairly robust. And what that does is that also allows you to cater it to the development that's happening, the mix of housing types that's happening, whether it's more family generating or something different. And so the obligation will be secured absolutely up front, but you'll have the ability to massage it as you.
So John, as you will recall, we've had some really great conversations here about retention and hillside development over the years. So when we took, what do we doing to ensure that this development in general fits into the natural landscape? How are we managing retention? And maybe one of the specific questions around that in previous goes at this, we did site by site and then made each owner come in and make requests, site-specific requests, then we spoke to phasing, retention around phasing as opposed to site-specific. So what's our approach for making sure retention and development suits the natural landscape?
Yeah, the biggest tool that you have is in the development permit area guidelines. That's been a little bit. There is a specific hillside development section, and again, what we have now, we know will be expanded on a little bit. The absolute key is that most of the issues that we ran into over the years were the result of not doing a substantial amount of pre-planning and locking things in up front. When a subdivision is created and there's no requirement that grades be at a certain level, one person might want to build up and the other person is left in the hole. And that's not what we're not doing anymore. We're not doing that in current hillside developments. All of them have required a comprehensive and coordinated approach to the grading and cutting and filling before anything is disturbed and before any approvals. That's the key. And then after that, it becomes a lot easier. Now, are there going to be instances where the retaining wall might not be zoning bylaw? That's absolute, but at least it'll be dealt with, like council has done with several recent ones on other hillside sites. It'll be dealt with comprehensively. You'll be able to see the drawings in advance, and you will know the implications of that visually and on other people, rather than an individual lot coming in and sure they might do it, but then does the neighbor want to do it as well? Like council was not in a good position with both of those, and we're going to create that, make sure that doesn't happen. The key is to do it up front.
Good to hear. Are there any more questions or comments on this section, or do we want to go on to the next? Yep, go ahead.
Just one other, and again, I realize this might be a level of detail that we're not at this point, but I guess to speak to that, the climate action charter enhanced for development permits. I have no idea that this is ever built into green practices, but also talking about replacement time for buildings, because building greenhouses is great and it saves tons of, they save a lot of energy, provided that they exist for a certain amount of time. And so I don't think it's necessarily been a problem, but just something it's making sure that we're not building how, if you build an energy efficient house and then it gets knocked down within 5 years to build another one, there's upfront energy costs to building energy efficient buildings. So just making sure that that's considered.
That's not a customary North American planning inspiration. I know this is in other places. Buildings are built kind of with a timeline attached to them. It's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah.
I don't know how we necessarily do that. The general approach here is we're trying to set a framework and a community character, and I know the proponents are of like mind, where a lot of these things will not have to be regulated. That through, because there's other tools that the village doesn't get to play with, like statutory building schemes and other things, where a lot of these individual house obligations and requirements, I have all confidence that the developers will be pushing some envelopes when it comes to green building and other things, because that's what they want to do. The key to success in a lot of these is to set the right framework, but not necessarily get overly heavy in the regulatory part of it and layer covenant over covenant over covenant and everything. But we've got some work to do on this.
I think we're good for now on that section.
Okay, I'm gonna jump to page something. So moving into development phasing. Again, we talked about phases 1, 2, and 3. We got a little bit fancy with the wording for reasons that are entirely my fault, but I don't know why I did it. Stage 1 is what we're considering phases 1 and 2. And what those the stage 1 lands are is they're lands that are being included in the sub area plan and an application for zoning is in place. The stage 3 lands are in the OCP sub area plan policy set, but are not part of the rezoning due to contamination. The phasing is critical and I don't know if this is going to be the ultimate phasing. I'd be absolutely certain that each of these phases that you see here will be demised into multiple subphases. This is not a marketable or saleable amount of development to take on at one chunk. But what often happens with the bigger project is there's different types of phasing. The one that we're most concerned about at rezoning is the servicing phasing. There's different triggers for big works and services that will be assigned to different phases. So let's just say hypothetically, there needed to be a big new pipe put somewhere. What we look at now is, does that have to happen before the development starts, or is that pipe good for the first 100 units, but is needed before the 400 unit, in which case we put it in phase 2. So what we're seeing here, I would not for a second think that phase 1, all of that development happens and is sold at once. That's not how it's going to happen. These are more the mega phasing triggers. This is probably the 3 servicing agreements you would see. There might be other smaller servicing agreements, and each phase will be a market appropriate and digestible chunk at a time. So yeah, it is a little bit different. So when it comes to phasing, this is anticipated, I believe, their market study, Michigan market studies in this market and at this time are moving targets. You know, this is not going to sell 100 units a year. I think this is probably still in the 15 to 20 units moving per year. So it will happen over a long time. So the impacts of this project happen over a long time. There's not, it's not like somebody can go on sabbatical for a year and come back and traffic's different and the hillside is different. They do happen over time. What we're really concerned about though is we want to make sure that we get the phasing right for applying the service and amenity triggers at the right ones. So we use a few tools. One is we will assign things by phase, others we may assign it by a unit number. And part of it again is this ongoing negotiation about making sure that if things are asked for at a time where there may be proceeds coming in, you can usually get more than asking for it up front. So we're going to have that conversation moving forward. Just really quickly running through the servicing proposal and policy. This document does not set out any level of detail at all about servicing. We may put in a map. There's certain areas that we want to take a policy approach on, and some of them have already been mentioned. But we're not going to use this document to approve things like this, as the water mains and the A value of the roads and all of those things. It becomes way too cumbersome. What it does is it starts establishing a few really important principles. One is that the developer pays, so the developer will pay all of the costs for the things that are needed to make this project work. And usually that also provides other things that are of benefit to the community. So road upgrades, water system upgrades, sanitary upgrades, storm upgrades. There is an opportunity through this to take care of some existing problems, and that will be done on the cost of the developer. The road, sidewalk, and traffic, there is some policy level discussions happening there. But the reality of servicing is it's not usually a policy issue. Roads and sidewalks and active transportation and transit head more into the policy realm, and that's what we've included. So we do have a range of policies looking at active transportation. So couldn't agree more with the points we heard earlier. We know transportation is changing. We look at the access to that road and it's not a direct shot to the downtown for anyone who's not in a car. Partisan people on hillside sites do not have to follow the same course. That's one of the mistakes that often happens on hillside is this ongoing marriage of sidewalks and pedestrian realm with vehicle realms. It doesn't work when we have roads that are switchbacks. We have some grades we have to contend with, but we're looking to make sure that those connections do adapt to things like e-bikes that specifically mentioned. We didn't get into scooters and other stuff, but we might as well. There's certainly the cycling network plan. This is the sort of site where I see there will be probably some accommodation on road, but I don't think that would be the priority because I don't think that would be desirable. Just because if you build a bike lane on a road, it's not desirable for people to bike on, they're not going to bike on. But we may have opportunities to separate those two realms and do a little better. So there are a few policies on active transportation. There's a few policies on hillside road standards under the vehicle traffic policy. We will be looking at, and we've been provided a cross section of what the different roads might look like. Again, a really critical consideration on any hillside development is minimizing the amount of cut and fill, because each meter or foot you take will create a road allowance. We think of how far back you have to chase those cuts and fills up the hill. That's what causes the biggest scoring, is road construction by far. So within the reason, we need to make sure that that says in here, we've got to be responsible for snow clearing or other users of the roads, those sort of things. These are not going to be goat trails, but they're also likely not going to be, 4-lane wide roads with extra sidewalks and parking lanes everywhere and all that stuff. So we've got to right size that. Again, a level of detail we're working towards. The transit, there is policy in there about making sure that the road construction accommodates electrical vehicles, car shares, other innovative transportation approaches, transit turnaround facilities, and each ways, transit friendly street network. But we're not assuming that it'll have bus service. So the idea of pullouts and other rest bays and other things, if they're thought of up front, they're easy to include. Retrofitting those is a challenge, so that we would expect that the policy would drive that sort of thing. Cooperative use of e-bikes, co-op cars, and other means. So we are trying to capture a lot of the spirit of it in here. And what I've heard earlier is that we probably want to continue that discussion and see how far we can take this policy, and then of course not lose sight of it as we move through more detailed levels. Community amenities, we've talked a fair bit about that, so I'll gloss over it, but I'm open to questions. We're just getting started. What the plan does include is not amenities being provided, but this is a statement that was prepared largely by the applicant about some of the amenities that arise out of the development itself. So things like infrastructure improvements, housing, environmental preservation, archaeological site preservation, affordable housing, community amenity contributions, and so on. So yeah, we're just getting started. And it'll be a good discussion, and I think there's some really creative ideas about where this may go. So I'm excited about it. And quickly, implementation, every OCP and Savaria plan has this implementation. In ours, we really just talk about other things that are happening. Again, the sub-area plan in and of itself, it sets the table for future development. It is not a tool that activates development on its own. The rezoning, we expect will run contemporaneously, and will refine the current development entitlement right from the site. And then the mix of when development permits and subdivision approvals and other things come in, that's not scripted yet, but that will be an ongoing back and forth between making sure that the village's interests are secured by development permits and subdivisions done by the approving officer, and then ultimately a whole bunch of servicing work in the middle. So we've just referenced it there, but a lot of that is still. So moving into any comments or questions on what we talked about with the servicing part, the implementation part, transportation section.
I just have a couple of comments on your one sheet. You showed 3 different areas that were transportation, and that was in there. One thing I've noticed with the plan are 2 things that have come up. One, I noticed that the only way that we can join sidewalks for, safe walk for kids to school and moms and things, because obviously Eagle Drive is not a good place to be. But I see that it would be nice to join the sidewalk from the new site through the Stale Park onto Dogwood, where then there's sidewalks going through. So, and I'd love to see that as part of the plan, not only just the sidewalk, but it needs to be lit, because obviously you're into trees and stuff like that. So, and it's something we can service in the winter time. The other question that's come up, and the mayor's brought it up, and we've all brought it up, Eagle Drive.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's 2 ways out of that area, and people keep forgetting Dogwood is still an access to downtown, and nobody ever talks about Dogwood, but that is a way in and out. But the people are more concerned about the bottom part of the road joining Pemberton Meadows Road.
Yeah.
And how narrow it is, and the fact that there's no bicycle lane, there's no walking lane and stuff like that. What part of that, or is that a part of the discussion?
That's actively being assessed. So we received a traffic impact study, and traffic impact studies, we've got to be really clear about what they are. They look at the intersections and the capacity of an intersection to convey traffic at a certain level of service. Traffic impact studies in the village of Pembina are not going to give you a lot of information. That's not where the problems are. The problems are just as you've described. You know, the road doesn't feel right here. The intersection is a little bit funky over here. It's not the scientific assessment. What we are looking at right now is we're looking at potential improvements on Eagle Drive to make it safer, make it a little wider, and address all of those things. And the applicants have taken that on their own accord based on the public feedback that they've received. So they're commissioning the initial studies, and the village has some collateral as well that I could probably share about how Eagle Drive might be improved. So again, it's not one of those improvements that's demanded by the model, because the model says everybody can turn right when they need to. You know, they don't have to wait 10 minutes as they're going. But we know it's an issue, and that's kind of where the servicing conversation is going. Where we know that a lot of the services and infrastructure is in the model really, really good, but we also know that there's little areas where hey, we need to fix this because it just doesn't work right or doesn't feel right. That's kind of what we're moving into. And so I would fully expect that by the time we get into the land development agreement discussions and the term sheet, there'll be a line item for Eagle Drive, and we'll decide what level of additional design and or improvement that will include.
If I just might, because the public's going to still ask the question. Where do you see that time frame being, Mr. Chalmers? Is that 2 months, 6 months out?
Well, it's the part of the next part of the process.
Okay.
What we're not likely going to have in 2 months is this is exactly what the road's going to look like and what's going to happen. We might not have that for 2 years because that will be an obligation of the development to do the detailed design. But we'll have an idea of what's going to be improved, what portion of Eagle Drive is going to be improved, and what the objective of that improvement is.
Okay.
So if it's widening, if it's removing lock blocks, if it's sight lines, those sort of things, we will be able to come back. What we do know is that certainly before this rezoning makes any traction anywhere, there will be an obligation in a land development agreement that says that the work must be done at the cost of the proponent, and it must be done at this stage of the development.
Okay, thank you.
Again, the proponent, they actually jumped the gun on us on that one. They've taken that work on their own, so it might be a little bit of a loom for how far they've advanced, but I know what's happening.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Councilor Nathan.
Thanks. Just a quick question through the mayor. Are green spaces considered a community amenity?
It's an interesting question. So generally not, unless they're foregoing a development. So what that means is on this site, a lot of the green space we're seeing is land that would either be challenging or cumbersome for them to develop, and they're getting, in this case, an equivalent amount of development on a different allocation of land. Where green space would be a community amenity is if there was land that was potentially developable, but you wanted a soccer field or a baseball field or something that was land intensive, and you were asking for a transfer of that land from private ownership to public ownership. That's an amenity to the extent that they're surrendering any commercial value. It's actually with parks, it's an interesting one because if you required them to build you a play field and they kept ownership of it, it's actually a deemed expropriation. It's our use. So there's a reason why it was usually transferred. In this case, most of the additional green space area, there'll be some discussion about the extent to which it's amenity driven, but if it's preserved, it's usually not a big part. And I'll close. Under the Local Government Act and Land Title Act, up to 5% of the land being subdivided can be set aside for a park or a cash and lieu payment made. So there will be some green space and park implementation tools. There's also an opportunity to look at a different level or different approach to stewardship or management of the green spaces on the site. Perhaps again, in the spirit of reconciliation and partnership with the Lot Nation, it might look a little different. The conventional options that exist usually are park dedication or some form of fee simple transfer. I would usually recommend a park dedication to put the land in a public trust. That might look a little different here because parkland vests to the municipality, and that might not That might not do justice to where the land came from or what it's intended to be used for. The conversation we have to have.
So that's that. Okay, great. Thank you. That conversation will continue.
That'll happen, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Comments? It's back to the phasing. We started the last slide, stage 1, stage 2, phase 1, 2, 3. And I know I already brought it up, but we all know I like to repeat myself. Just seeing the, you know, when we get into, or when future councils get into stage 2 or phase 2 and then stage 2, phase 3, just being able to look at what has been done, what has changed, and have that opportunity. I just want to make sure that's part of this plan and part of this process. So that, again, we both said it, things change. I want to make sure we're adaptable and flexible.
Yeah, and one of the things that we might look at, we haven't included an awful lot of language about what the phase 3 rezoning will entail. We're using it just like a normal OCP. There's the land uses, there's a general allocation of what they might look like. That's the normal role of an OCP, and then the zoning comes in and massages the detail. There may be cause for us to put in some language about how phase 3 may go through a quick review to make sure that this. Yeah, but it's not going to compel an OCP amendment to do stage 3. You wouldn't want, I don't think you'd want to do that. And so it'll be a rezoning exercise, but we could put in some ideas into the rezoning direction about things that could be considered like housing needs and that sort of thing.
I guess for my thought comes from is we have an opportunity here to look at a whole neighborhood, a whole part of the community. So we're taking a broad lens and we're saying, okay, you know, in future conversations, we're going to talk about CACs, what kind of parklands and gathering space is being provided, community gardens, trails, that sort of thing, what kind of diversity of housing is being constructed, which is great. To be able to start there, like you said, it's harder to do things retroactively. So I think it's a huge opportunity for us. And I'm glad we're taking that very high level, broad view on it. But I'm not going to pretend that we're going to get it all right. And that as the first phase goes through, things will come up and things will be noticed. A lack of this amenity, more need for, I'm just picking an example, gathering space or even better architecture. So I just want to make sure that all these values and principles that we're embedding into the sub area plan, we're getting right, and we have the ability to make sure that.
Yeah, and I think we're getting pretty close. Because really what the art of writing a CP language is that it can mean sometimes different things at different times. I mean, right now, we know that housing diversity is maybe the bigger challenge that's facing us. And so when we get to the rezoning, we'll be focusing a little more on housing diversity. In 15 years, the council that's dealing with that rezoning for stage 3 might take a policy set out of the plan and say, no, this is way more important than housing diversity. And still are both approvable rezonings under the plan. So, but I think I made a note here for things that just to look at. So maybe some language that when it gets to phase 3, look at some flexibility to rezone to specific needs like housing. Amenities, whatever it may be.
Thank you. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, I would add that the way that the housing needs assessment works and the OCP is going to work is the housing needs report to do every 5 years. And so that the national plan to reassess what the housing rate is. And then the OCP is supposed to be about every 10 years. So each of those are going to give opportunity. Okay, do we have it right over here or anywhere else in the community?
Comments or questions?
All right, now to the good stuff. The development permit area guidelines. So council's familiar with this tool. You have them in the CP, and the village has some that apply to land and some that apply to buildings. And we've followed that here. That is the kind of preferred approach. This is the part of the area plan that will be used more regularly on a day-to-day basis. And I could honestly speak for the rest of the day about the tools the province has given us through the development permits, but suffice to say, I'm not a big fan. Because what the act gives you is it gives you the authority to create guidelines, not rules, not restrictions, not detailed designs, guidelines, and you're supposed to use the guidelines in your OCP to assess what are becoming increasingly detailed submissions on buildings and land alteration. So it's at best a cumbersome tool to use. It doesn't really align, and council may remember from some of my other ramblings over the years that really the threshold for our guideline is that unless the application for development permit is on a collision course with it, meaning that it says one thing and the application says the exact opposite, council really doesn't have discretion with development permits. You have to approve. So these are not always the easiest things to put together. And especially because we're trying to take some general development permitting guideline concepts and apply them one level lower. We're kind of still at the more general OCP level. And if we stay there, that's fine. That's probably fine. But I can see there's a few areas where, as we work through this, and probably our next session, we'll have a really concentrated exercise on development permit guidelines to get into some specifics on wording and perhaps even some little test cases and what they might look like. But I'm quite pleased with where we are with them and how they've turned out. But most importantly, we're covering some areas that are not currently in the OCP. So we've been doing some hillside development permits, but based on guidelines that are not specific to hillside development. They're environmental protection guidelines and natural spaces guidelines and other things. So we've kind of stepped back and said, what do we really need on this site? And there's certain development permit area guidelines that you'll need in your OCP that do not apply to this site. I know we don't have any industrial development contemplated or desired, some of those things. So, but the classes that we have, they fall into two classes, and they're really important differences. Land-based development permit area guidelines, again, the act tells us what we can have developed permit area guidelines for. And the ones that we have here are protection of the natural environment and riparian areas. So that's an important one that kind of speaks for itself. Geological hazard protection, there's again the ability to protect against landslip and some other hazards. And then wildfire hazard protection. So currently the village does have something that's closer to the natural environment and riparian areas. The geological hazard, there's again some less direct reference. And then wildfire is a new TPA guideline that we're using specifically in the plan to guard against that hazard. Those development permits, sometimes they come in with the same development permit as a building. So wildfire, it's effectively about establishing setbacks from a forested area and doing certain things in that setback. That might come in as an application for a townhouse development, they might show that. But where these also come up is even before development, building development, sometimes at subdivision, as I mentioned earlier, the notion of hillside development, if we were doing a hillside development subdivision, we have the authority to ask for this as a prerequisite to subdivision, so that we understand how the grades work and how the building envelopes are set and those sort of things. So those are the land-based ones. Then there's another type which is form and character, and you can, under the act, you can kind of regulate the character. Not supposed to go too far, we go a lot further than you're supposed to, like everyone else. But some of the areas that are included in there, this is where the hillside development guidelines rest. We've also included small lot residential as a specifically targeted set for this particular project. And then fairly more conventional multifamily and commercial development permit. So I'm not sure if you've had an opportunity to look at these in any measurable details, but these are the ones where we start getting a little bit more concerned about wording and comprehension. Each section has its kind of really boring language that it has to have to justify why it's a development permit area guideline and what it's intending to do. And then it has a series of things that have to be met. Some of them are a little easier to achieve than others. Things like most of the land-based are science-based. So for example, the riparian areas regulation that the province has is very specific about who can write a report and what that report must say. And the report must be filed at the province, and then individuals come to us at that report. And there's not much left for us to say other than, hey, we want a trail and stringe it, or we want to perhaps modify it to get some extra space around this area, and we'll take a little reduction with it. So a lot of these are on science-based. They typically go through as minor development permits, which are developed by staff. Similarly, geological and wildfire has a global eye on professional submissions by qualified professionals, and then we simply take those recommendations. Those kind of reports always come with recommendations at the back. we take those recommendations and make sure they're reflected in the approval. We usually quite literally attach them. And then form and character, there's not a lot in here. We're not, there's no request yet to turn it into something that it's not. So there's not theming or specific details of dealing with the OTP has about what the buildings will look like. And again, as guidelines, we can't get too specific, but we can certainly start establishing a character. So the conventional references to natural materials reflecting the place, reflecting adjacent development. The one area I'll just highlight a little bit is I think we're hoping for council indulgence to follow a smarter approach to landscaping on these sites. So council will control landscaping to some extent, potentially on small lot, but definitely on multifamily and commercial. I think we'd like to get away from things that require a lot of irrigation, things that require a lot of maintenance, especially on a hillside site. There's an opportunity to reduce the amount of landscaping because it's framed in green and they'll have access to parks everywhere. So we haven't used the word xeriscaping, which is like no landscaping, but we're hoping to do something a little bit different, and I intend to move that forward a little more. And then there are some references in the plan and the guidelines to create some comprehensive character, and we would expect that as we move forward. Things like street signs, street lights, those sort of things. There'll be some unifying elements that come out. Some of those will translate into development permits. A lot of them will be in the public realm, but things like entrance signage into a townhouse complex, we'd like to see some continuity in the naming conventions and the type of forms. So you know where you are when you're there. So this is the one area that I would think that at the next session, we would probably spend a little more time going through in detail, but I'm happy to answer any questions from your first review.
Questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, under form and character, how far can we go? I've got notes down here from your report and stuff, and I'm looking at things like, do I want to see boats and trailers and some front yards up there, or do I want to see a specific site allocated for that type of thing? That bothers me. I look around the community now, and some parts of the community are looking pretty, is the word drab, maybe because we got a tent here that's falling down, and we got boats and we got RVs and stuff on there. So and with the requirement for the extra parking, if we're going to allow suites, all of a sudden the whole front yard could be a parking lot, and I don't want to see that. So is this a part where you can talk about forming character?
Well, it is. It is in a way, and it's not in other ways. What the development permits will allow us to do as forming character is do things like make sure there's not too much parking. And if you don't have too much parking, then it's going to be hard to store your revenue. And if you don't have too much parking, then there's not going to be junk vehicles. So some of those things, yes, that kind of management and nuisance stuff, really what the development permit does is it authorizes either a subdivision or a building permit. So once that building permit's done, it doesn't really get into anything that we can use to regulate behaviors. That's more zoning and other nuisance bylaw stuff. But form is really, really, really important to directing the sort of things that you want. And sometimes the things, including the things you don't want. And often one of the, if you're really concerned about somebody driving too fast on the road, you can put in a speed bump, so you can make a road that makes them drive slower. It's kind of the idea. So some of it we can certainly look at, and that's part of our role in design. How we would translate those into the guidelines, I'm not entirely sure. But things like the small lot, we'd probably minimize front driveway lengths. As an example. We would look at pulling the buildings perhaps closer than the driveway than the garages. Recessing the garages. There's certain things that we could do at a small lot level where we're not getting into the details of the building, but we're dealing with it. The multifamily and townhouse, we can pretty much vary. So, some places. Again, it really reflects what you're trying to achieve. Just writing some guidelines in another jurisdiction where they're requiring that in addition to the garage, there be a full parking lane driveway for each townhouse, because they're concerned that the garage will not be used for vehicles, but will instead be used for storing stuff, and people will park on each other's lawn and everything else. One way to look at it is now there's additional parking in the front. The other is now that everybody's gonna for sure use their garage as a storage. And now if they have 3 cars, one going on the street, or maybe they put their boat in the driveway. So is it solving the problem? Could be real, but is that the right solution? I don't know. But those are some of the things that we go through when we look at some of these plans. But if you have any ideas about how we can use form and character to create more desirable outcomes, that's absolutely fair game to the guy, for sure.
Thank you.
Just more of a process question, so. You were saying that this is the guidelines, not rules, because I noticed in like some of the language, it says will or shall versus should. But what I'm hearing from you is that these are. What we want, but so I guess how is something, if it's not completely in alignment with guidelines, how is it not on a collision course?
Well, wow.
So I also, and if that's completely,
That's exactly the problem. It's exactly the problem because guidelines is defined by different places in different ways. It was really common in some of the guidelines, and man, I wrote this many years ago that your use of natural materials is encouraged and stucco is prohibited. It was something a big issue with the council. So is that a rule or a guideline on it? Nobody tests these things until you get sued, until it's challenged in a court. So you can get very specific, but the more specific you get, the less flexible you get. And the real dynamic of how these work is that an applicant, an architect or a developer comes in and meets with staff, and most are trying to create the best product possible because it's really the most interested party in having the best product is usually the developer that's going to sell it. And we go back and forth and we looked at the guidelines. So in the stucco example, if someone came in with a stucco building, we would say, well, that's stucco, and the guidelines say it can't be stucco, so that's a no. I think I've told the story here before, where we had a guideline that talked about all these fancy things about relationship to the floodplain and meeting flood construction level and qualified reports. And a guy came in and he applied to build his house on the river side of the dike. And he met all the requirements of the guidelines. And so we walked to the council, and the council said, this is ridiculous. We can't have a guy building his house in the middle of the Squamish River. And at staff, we're like, well, but he's met all the guidelines. He's provided all of the reports that he needed to provide. He's done all of the things he needed to do. So council said, no, we're not going to give him the development permit. And once the Supreme Court of British Columbia, British Columbia said, Cameron, did you meet the guidelines? I'm going to put a record just saying yes. We had told councils they had to issue the permit, they chose not to. I got his permit. Never built the house. But never built a house, but he got a big chunk of change out of the municipality for his cost. So that's the problem with guidelines generally, is you want to find a spot where you have enough flexibility to encourage and approve good design, because we can't think up the best design for now. But you also want to make sure that you're doing enough that the important things like hillside development are done in a way where you've got all the information you need to make a meaningful decision and anticipate the problems. I would not want to get into design guidelines where we're trying to prescribe what the building character should be. I don't want this neighborhood we don't want to theme it in any way. We want to let it evolve as it will, because that's how the best neighborhoods usually happen. But there's certain things that are important that we need to address. And some of them, if we look at the forming character of multifamily, for example, I'm perhaps a little more concerned about making sure that the landscaping is sustainable and that the outdoor space is usable and that the site works so they have about what it was.
So I haven't known where to ask this question, so I'll just ask it now.
Yeah.
And with all these considerations and the new direction from the provincial government in terms of what they might be imposing or requiring, in terms of zoning, allowing for fourplexes and all that sort of thing. We're doing a very thorough planning process here. How's that being considered? So that we don't have to do it again.
We're talking there's still, again, one individual opinion, there's still a fair bit of hair on some of those announcements. And it's like a lot of provincial announcements. The intent's fantastic. the goal, the way to get there is curious. And now all the ugly parts come out, right? Architects have implications and that. We don't know exactly where that's going, but I will say our conversations with the applicants have all been in that spirit and the whole missing middle approach. If it looks the same as the structure on either side of you, but there happens to be 3 different people or 3 different demise suites in it, what's the difference? Why does it matter? And again, referencing back to my street, I think at my end of the block, I think my family's the only one that actually occupies this entire. The others are all demised in multiple suites. It works really well. Good. It's not parking mayhem. And every once in a while, somebody might park a little too close to the hydrant, that happens anyways. But we're starting to look at those. How we're going to directly respond to the province. I knew that question was coming and I knew that I didn't have an answer.
That's unusual for you.
Didn't mean I didn't say it. Feel I'm gonna do other work.
Okay, fair enough, and I figure, I know that you're driven, there's still a lot of hair, and I know there's a lot to sort through on those announcements. And that's why I'm asking the question, because as I'm doing all this work, I would hate to see some of that work have to get pulled back.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't apply to new regulation.
Well, some of the things that we would need to consider, and like where the hair lives is right now, if you do a building with more than 3 units, and the unit is defined as a self-contained unit, if you do more than 3, it triggers a development permit. Notwithstanding all of the fire suppression issues and everything else, but we would need to look at, there's in all village policy, there's a massive number of concatenated amendments that would have to happen to make that work. Right? Not that you couldn't do them, certainly. And that's maybe a good example too, where things may happen outside of us and outside of this plan that affect it, that we'll need to find a way to respond to. So yeah, that's definitely in the parking lot of things we need to deal with.
And Councilor Nango.
Thank you. This is a process question. I'm just curious how the development permit area applies to the environment in a bigger picture. I guess what I'm trying to say is like we've come to the agreement that housing is really, really tricky. We don't know, we can't pin it down. We don't know 20 years from now what the landscape's going to look like. It's really complicated, and I recognize that. But the one thing that we can be very sure of, and I think we would all agree, is that the climate is changing, and the impacts of that are being felt. Well, very recently with the heat and the air quality. And I'm just curious how it may not be applicable, but does development permit areas, is there a way to use that to ensure that we have just there's a guarantee that green space and trees and all that is just part of is just mandatory? Do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, obviously we can have tree bylaws and all that sort of thing, but I'm curious how the development permit area, how that works with just ensuring there's adequate amounts of green space, there's adequate amounts of shade and all that sort of thing. And yeah.
That is a fantastic question. More so because there is the ability to have specific development permit area guidelines for climate action. And there's a reason why we don't have them in this plan. And I don't think we need them, quite honestly, is going back to that conversation about principles. Like the layout of this, more than half of the site is being preserved as green space. A lot of the housing type is intended to be lower impact. The green building initiatives, all of those things. I think that the climate action development permit area guidelines are something, and Colin's not here, but I assume they will be in the OCP generally for development, because they'll be much more important at that scale where you're dealing with individual pieces trying to make a bigger whole. But we don't really need them in this plan, because the approach to climate action is really fundamental to a lot of it. So to say that a 12 unit 3-block townhouse development needs a development permit specific to climate action, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it would be fruitful. I don't think it'd be useful. But overall, stepping outside of this plan, that is a really exciting tool that municipalities now have to create development permit areas for climate action, because when you're dealing with these at a community-wide scale and dealing with one little piece at a time, if each little piece makes a contribution to the whole, it makes a big difference. But in this case, we're starting with the whole first. So we're not as concerned about the small pieces.
Right, okay, thank you.
That's when they come, go ahead.
So just to clarify, you anticipate that we have a session where we dive into these in a bit more detail on the wording and things like that?
Okay, then I'm going to use that as my next steps. We're now 15 minutes behind, but I have no to fall. So, yes, I think what I think makes the most sense, we've received a number of comments today. And we will probably might receive a few more that have been a good indication that we're going to move forward. We've got some things that we really need to dig into, and those were gratefully the things that we were likely going to have to dig into anyways. So we've got a lot of things on the go right now that, and I've talked about all of these, but there's the servicing, there's the housing options. There's some additional intricate consultation that's happening. I think the thing what would make the most sense for us is to take this to the next level of detail. So probably when we have the draft of the zone, we have a draft of the term sheet. We've gone through at least the first round of any negotiations. None of this gets solidified without your involvement. But if we get a couple steps further into resolution now, then we can come back in and we'll report out on the things that have been mentioned, which we will get by resolution. We'll report out on those and then start filling in some of the gaps. I think that would be a good time for another committee as a whole. I think that also would probably be a suitable time to start some consultation with the community, because we'll have more answers to the questions that we know that they have. Right? Like if we can talk a little more intelligently about upgrades to Eagle Drive, or we can start talking about amenities that might be coming so that we can contextualize some of the trade-off. I think that would be a good time for us to move forward. I'm not getting a sense that we've completely missed the mark. We may not have hit everything yet, but the importance of this session was we can now comfortably move forward. So yeah, again, these last two slides are basically a summary of a lot of the conversation we've had today. These are the things that we have yet to do. And the consultation, our recommendation is that we do that once we go a little bit further. Then after that, we will certainly have to do another round of agency referrals with the plan, and probably the zoning, a draft of the zoning bylaw attached. We will probably, that would be a good time for us to go out and check everything. So we've had a few information in sessions. We've had one session about this, two sessions about this is what it's translating to. We'll have another one about this is what the plan looks like and the zoning looks like today. And then we'd be in a position to start moving into bylaws.
As we get into further detail about housing diversity, phasing and all that sort of thing, where in this roadmap you've given us do we potentially, if feel the need, discuss something like a housing agreement around some of these?
Yeah, so the next session would look a lot different than this one, because now we have some parts that we know are of interest to community as a whole, and we'll isolate in on those, and we'll come in. It's more like an issue-based or an issue paper format, where we would lay out, this is what the draft plan says, this is the direction you gave us. This is kind of the range of responses, so that we get right down to title restricted housing agreement, regulated affordable housing versus allowing people to have an RV plug in on the side of their house so they can rent an RV pad. Who knows what that will be? And then we have to check that all in with the work that's being done through the housing needs assessment and see how that all fits. But that would give us a defined issue that we might kick around for an hour. And out of that, we would be able to pull out the final policy directions. So when we look at the housing diversity, that's certainly one. At that time, we would also have the benefit of saying this is an option of how it may translate into zoning. And we probably wouldn't make a hard recommendation. So that's where I'm going with the next session committee of the whole. We pick the big issues, everything would still be on the table. We pick the big issues and get into the details. We would likely release to you a second draft of the plan based on the refinements that happen at around the same time and release to you a draft of the zoning and a draft of the cover sheet so you can start seeing how it looks. That one, today we were looking more for ideas, we've been trying to hone it in. Now that we've got that, the next one would be looking at quite specific directions and more. So the last piece of the puzzle, we did include in the recommendation 2 different resolutions. They're not related, you can relate them if you want, but one is related to process, that's exactly the whole recommendation to council, that staff be directed to consider the following process suggestions for implementation as the next steps of the sub-area plan process. Is there anything specific to process that you'd like to mention?
I mean, it's hard to kind of go back to some of I mean, you took notes as we went through, but I guess.
Well, that's a little more pertinent to the second one, which is the specific areas that you want us to chew on.
Okay.
So we can just think about that for a sec. I'll go through and I'll give you a quick summary of all of the notes that I've liked, and if you're welcome to add to these. For a set requirement for affordable housing percentage, either on-site or off-site within a specific time period.
So this is in the first one, this is in the process, like you have the two recommended resolutions here.
This would be in the second one.
The second one,
This would be
yeah.
in the second one.
Yeah.
And we may only end up with one if council doesn't have it, or committee doesn't have specific directions for the process yet. We didn't have any there, it's a bulk of them.
He just went past over.
Yeah. Okay. Review exemption for affordable housing and applicability of housing agreements. Housing diversity options, affordable and mixed separated by phase. Each bench contain diversity allocated throughout. I'm just gonna distribute it there. Climate chart action charter enhanced for DP, so for development process or development permits. Reference to active transportation and the importance of that and accommodating all the diverse options that exist, and then signage and education opportunities. Related to reconciliation. Are you copying down?
Oh, it went too fast.
Oh, it's okay. That's why I didn't necessarily am furious.
Yeah, I got those notes down. Thank you.
Or.
And you have the phase 3.
Phase
Yeah.
3 flexibility, so.
That would probably be process, wouldn't it?
There's actually that's a policy direction for phase 3, so. And then. So we've done it here. I'm not sure how particular you want to get about the wording.
All of which we can work on. If there are any changes you want to make to the wording, as long as the basic concepts are there, maybe we can work on that after.
And so in terms of the process, really what this is saying is that we would take a look at each of these suggested these areas identified, and we would return to a future committee of the whole. We kind of outlined that future committee of the whole would probably be when we make a little bit more tracking on getting into some of the zoning definition, which will help speed up things like housing diversity and other things. We'll get a little bit further into some of the engineering offsite, which will help with some of the issues like Eagle Drive and some of the other things that we know are of interest. And we'll likely be in a position to report out on the at least initial amenity negotiations and term sheet and we're not calling it we'll call it an outcome and a financial scene on the project. So the first one, set a requirement for affordable housing percentage either on the federal site within a specific period of time. Review the exemption for affordable housing. Density. So we'll massage the word. Deliberated at a council meeting, but
Councilor Megan go over that first. Thank you.
Go ahead, Christine.
You're on mute.
You're muted.
You do have your hands again?
Dave?
I'm just wondering, we've got explore a set of requirements for affordable housing percentage. Can we explore a set of requirements for green space? A percentage based on the number of housing units?
Well, it's already in.
I don't know if that's something we can do.
the green space will be set by land use, the big pieces. So I don't know that right now the percentage is somewhere between 45% and 55% of the site is green space.
So, yeah, I appreciate that. It's just that, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that we can use the word green space, but we'll just take the village of Pemberton, for example. Like, we're surrounded by green space, but it doesn't mean we're looking at it, but it's not necessarily, some of us may be riding our bikes in it, and some of us may be walking in it. But in terms of the actual village, the concentrated village center, there's actually very little green space. And so this is a dense area that is being proposed. And I'm curious about how and if that kind of requirement can be embedded within the development, because we can be looking at all the surrounding area, but it doesn't mean it's actually a space where, and I'm not talking about soccer fields, and I'm not talking about recreating. I'm talking about just green space that is being proven over and over again to be really important for people for many reasons, and people of different ages.
I think perhaps for now, if you remember, we look at something like refine the green space definitions and allocations. It's not one that I would, for a project like this, think a proportion or percentage is the right way to go.
Okay.
So I think we can get to what you're looking for, but maybe with a slightly different path.
I think there's two sides to it too, like in Council Nightingale is referring to, the green space that the geography will allow for or provide naturally, but I think maybe some of what Councillor Nightingale's concerns would be captured to the TAC part of the discussion in terms of gathering green space, in terms of usable green space. Yeah,
that's certainly, that's a natural extension of where we're going. So what I recorded was clarification of green space allocation by type and amount. So that would include developed urban green spaces, that would include We probably even include the requirement for the on-site green space that's required under the guidelines we drafted. So.
Sorry, I just didn't hear that. I'm sorry, I didn't just hear that last part you said.
Okay, so we would look at all types of green space, including the requisite outdoor open space for multifamily and townhouse projects. Then we would look at the public developed green space and start giving some thought to the types and allocations, and then work our way up to the natural areas and open spaces.
Can I capture your thoughts, Councilor Nightingale?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and then at the next session, we can talk about whether that's an adequate green space layer or whether we need to enhance the policy.
Great, thank you.
We'll report back specifically on that one.
Councilor Armstrong, Jeremy?
No, I'm good now.
Any other additions or thoughts to the plan directions here from the committee?
Do we need anything in there about the Eagle Drive access and what we had talked about a little bit earlier? Or is that?
It would naturally happen anyways, but there's nothing.
Yeah. But it's comment about Eagle Drive and safe and appropriate access.
So that would be Eagle Drive, and we'll report on the secondary access. But I think these are all really useful to us because they'll just slightly tweak the things we're working on anyway, but it'll give us a really clear path for the next meeting.
And active transportation inclusion, does that allow for set capture and shuttles and that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Transformation, yeah.
Yeah, so we've kind of made some general statements and we'll check those and see if we're on the right track.
Anything else to add? Somebody like to make that motion? Councilor Craddock, second by Councilor Nightingale, further discussion. Any opposed? Motion carries. I think we've captured it all in this one motion here, have we not?
Yeah, that's all we need.
Okay. Any wrap up comments, Mr. Chalmers?
Just to close the day, thank you very much. I know these things they're not easy to go through. And I have to say, this is the first one where I've done, that didn't seem like it had a big flat point issue. Like I think back to the big ones that you might be familiar with, waterfront 90, 20-story towers. That was, this is one that was a little more general. I'm very grateful for the feedback, and I think we'll be able to, through the natural course, be able to build on the comments we've made and provide you back what you need. Keep doing it up to move it forward.
Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it seems to me that in your presentations, you said that the developers have already brought stuff forward that you haven't asked for. Sounds like the working relationship is very positive, and that's nice to hear too.
Well, it is, like Caroline and I actually know each other. 20 years, some years, and when she was in this seat and I was sitting in my director seat and collaborator and stuff. It's really important that we have that good relationship because we're both trying to do the best thing. We're both trying to figure out what the best solution for that land is. We don't agree on everything that much, but we're able to work through those things, and the information flow has been great. We have to give credit where it's due. If we ask for something, we can get it right away. And like I said, with Eagle Drive, we didn't even ask, and they're sending it through because they know it's coming. So it's been productive so far, and it makes the process a lot more. Like at the end of the day, the result is something that we work toward, and we're that's up to you.
We're trying to do did a great job taking us through it today. It was really clear and broken down really well. Not bad for your first time. So, yes, thank you for that. It was really good.
Thank you.
I'm working on another project. It's a very planned and another community. There's something how Cameron has laid it out to all of you and how it's great. He's not having you jump ahead on different things, whatnot. And actually probably will send this recording because I think this is how it should be done. In each step, you're raising issues. We got to come back to you our way of resolving these issues, and I think it really is helpful from an applicant to divide it up like this, but also for all of you to know that your concerns are being heard. And you know, the public meeting we just did and the pop-up, I would say, pop-up was really valuable. You know, it wasn't huge, but white people stayed a long time. And so that was good. And you know me, I'm about co-creation of a plan. We're working with Tom Barrett now on a Parks and Trail plan, which because we, again, Place Park's great on the land plan, but Tom has really worked in Parks and Trails in this corridor, and it's important. And then the Eagle Drive, same, you know, working, getting the geotech engaged and all those things. Because those are really important, what we heard from the community.
You're 3 minutes over, not bad.
I only have 3 minutes. Thank you. Thank you.
So let's do business here. 6 point. More.
Yeah, I just have.
Yeah, that's just that.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Yes, it's actually out there. Yeah, it is waiting.
Everybody's coming rumble right in the middle. So
Oh,
Did you not hear me?
I thought it was mine, but I could hear it over here.
Send me that. Yeah, an email. Thank you. Thank you. Cameron.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Do you want the door closed, or you-
No, we're good.
Okay.
Okay, we have this one other item. For committee of the whole, it's the UBCM minister follow-up regarding statutory farm tax exemption.
Yeah, so council provided us direction on who we wanted to meet with, and then asked to have an opportunity. After you've had an opportunity to think if there's anybody else that you wanted to meet with at UBCM. Staff just put together the list to remind you who you had put forward. We also had said that we would go back and do a little bit of research around a couple of the minister meetings that you had requested. One with respect to the Minister of Forests. The village did put forward a motion to UBCM last year on the Crown land weights, and the ministry did provide a response with everything that they're doing and how things have changed over the last couple of years. I can vouch for the fact that we're starting to get these things coming in very quickly, which is great because it means that we're closing up some of our outstanding items, and particularly around renewals. So just wanted to see if the council or committee was still interested in having that meeting with the Minister of Forests. And the other one was meeting with the Minister of Finance as a follow-up from the 2018 resolution that went to meeting around a farm exemption tax implementation of the farm, what's called statutory farm tax exemptions within the municipality. It is a very complex issue. When council met with the minister last time, the minister asked us to follow up, was not specific on what they wanted us to follow up on, with the intention that they would share it with the Minister of Agriculture. Unfortunately, I think due to staffing changes, COVID, pandemic, all sorts of things, there was never any follow-up on that. And the initiative that drove that request initially didn't move forward with the boundary extension not being supported by the community and by council due to the cost of taking on the roads. So the question for council or the committee is, do you want to proceed with the minister meeting on this matter? Another alternative is to submit a resolution requesting to UBCM requesting that province investigate the implementation of a statutory farm tax exemption within a municipality. A couple of things on that. Right now, farms do get a certain amount of exemptions already. They're taxed at a lower or different rate. Or not all of the farmland is taxed at the farm rate, so they have exemptions already applied. The other thing is that if you did put the statutory farm tax exemption in, it would apply to all buildings and the property, and we would see a reduction in the taxation that we collect through property tax, and we would have to look at how we make that up in other ways. We're fortunate in our community, it doesn't really impact a lot because we only really have 8 properties that are identified as farm. Not all of them are actively farms that they haven't all made application for farm status. But in a larger municipality, say some of those in the Lower Mainland, like Chilliwack or Anmore, and that it could have a big impact on their tax collection. So we just would like to get some direction from council on those 2 items.
So my comments to open up would be that I feel like the farm tax one, since there's no specific need that we, if we sit in a meeting with the minister, they ask us how this applies to Pemberton. I feel like there is no really specific application at this point. I feel like this one and maybe the Ministry of Forest belong as resolutions on the floor. They're broader and they apply to the whole province rather than just our community. So and might actually garner more support than a meeting. Plus, I don't even know if we get that meeting on it since it's so general. So yeah, I don't know.
So the Minister of Forest was a resolution last year, and it was endorsed and received the permission. So we can't actually bring that one back.
So in terms of
As a resolution.
breaking it down, then the first one, then in terms of the farm tax exemption. Again, we don't have a particular applicable need to it right now, so personally, I feel that it might belong better as a resolution on the floor for the whole. Yeah. Okay.
Speaking about the statutory farm tax exemption, I would agree. Seems like that would be the best course of action is to go by way of EBCM resolution. If we are talking about the 10-year question, I thought that was raised in respect of a specific issue that we've had where it was, we put in an application, it was something like 18.
That's normal. They when you submit an application, they will say 18 to 24 months renewal or a review.
Yeah, and it's come back and they've said, well, no, now you need this thing, this other thing, and it's going to potentially take another 18 to 24. I'm just wondering also how that dives in with their response to resolution where they said 140-day response. I don't know if I'm confusing 2 different things. I think you are. We have an application in right now that is under review. There may be some elements to it that need to be added, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the application is extended out to another 2 years. So I think we were basing that off a conversation that Mr. Chima had with our consultants, but without all the information. Okay.
So that was the kind of, I think his thought was that if we do end up in a situation where we need council's help, we would come forward with it. At this time, not necessarily needed. So and it would be difficult to go to the minister and ask them to fast track an application when we've only just submitted it. So it's kind of one of those things that if we had submitted it a year ago or 2 years ago and we're still waiting, then maybe there would be value, but they are moving everything through pretty quickly. It's just that if we don't have all the information, they ask for more, and that's kind of on us or if they need more information, then we have to provide it.
One of the other reasons we've discussed in the past is at the table. Is the Dyking District, for instance, has struggled with this over the past when they've tried to do big and small work and then have to wait for applications to take 2 years. So there was a few layers to it that way. And that's why I think it was well placed as a resolution. And as Sheena said, it's been endorsed. And moved along the chain. So any other comment? I mean, so we're definitely requesting meetings for the fire hall and medical clinic.
Yeah.
My sense, and unless people feel differently, is that the Ministry of Force, we can leave that one for now and maybe just do a resolution for the farm tax extension. Oh, sorry, Katrina, I didn't see that. Go ahead.
That's okay. Did we not, I can't remember, but I thought we put a request in for the Minister of Environment to discuss a regional transit. And us being able to.
We're going through the SRD with the regional district for that.
Oh, right.
That and some other flood
Yep,
mitigation
yep.
issues that are
Yep.
regional in nature.
Thanks.
And I'm in regional district meetings tomorrow, so I'm gonna be bringing that forward tomorrow.
I think one of the things we need to talk about in the future is EV cars. And how we're gonna tax them to pay for highway improvements and stuff, because right now they pay nothing. And through gasoline tax, cars and trucks, and everybody are paying through the taxes. So it's something that has to be looked at in the future, because they're driving for free right now. That was an article that came out just recently. Yeah, it's become a real issue in most communities and provinces, is they're not paying any cost of highway improvement.
I don't know, that's something we want to tackle right now, or is that just you just looking at for the
I
future?
want to put that out there because I think it's something for LMNGA at the next meeting, and we can work that forward, but I want to start that conversation.
Sure, yeah, okay,
Thank you.
enough.
Lunch.
So, again, the other two is everybody good with leaving the Ministry of Forests
Yes.
out? Running heads, okay, and everybody's good with the resolution, farm tax exemption. Do you have something to work with on that? I feel like from our previous brief.
Yeah, we can pull together, so I just, we'll have to bring it back. Because you have to make a resolution at the council meeting, so we'll prepare a resolution.
So a motion from the committee to direct staff to prepare a resolution around farm tax exemption for the UBCM resolution process, moved by Laura, seconded by Gina. Any opposed? Motion carries. I second. Did you have that? Anything else on that? Okay. Then I think just a motion to adjourn committee of the whole. Councilor Scott, Councilor Ramsden, any opposed? We're adjourned. Take a quick lunch break and then we'll get into our.